Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about a morning when silk turned to sorrow, when joy became paperwork, and when love learned that the state keeps its own calendar. It's the story of a bride whose wedding was ruined not by cold feet or family drama, but by something far more mundane and infinitely more cruel. A tax collector with perfect timing and no heart. Picture this. Dawn light filtering through wooden shutters, casting golden squares across a carefully folded wedding dress, white silk that took months to afford, embroidered with threads that cost more than most people earned in a season. A young woman's hands tremble as she counts coins one final time. Her dowry, saved copper by copper, representing not just money, but hope, tradition, the promise of a future built on something solid. Then 3 knocks at the door, not the gentle rap of well-wishers or the excited chatter of bridesmaids. 3 official knocks that sound like hammers against wood, against dreams, against the assumption that some moments are too sacred for bureaucracy to interrupt. Sometimes the state takes what love cannot give. Sometimes paperwork weighs more than promises. And sometimes, on the morning you plan to start your new life, you discover that your old life still owes taxes you never knew existed. The contradiction is almost beautiful in its cruelty. Here stands a woman dressed for the happiest day of her life, clutching documents that prove the unhappiest truth, that joy, no matter how pure, must answer to the ledger book, that even love requires official permission to proceed. This happened somewhere in history, in some kingdom whose name time has blurred, but whose bureaucracy remains sharp as ever. The year doesn't matter because this story repeats itself across centuries, across cultures, across the endless human attempt to build systems that serve us better than we serve them. What matters is the moment when personal happiness collides with impersonal administration, when the poetry of human celebration meets the prose of government forms. So dim the lights around you. Let the glow of your screen become the only torch lighting this ancient corridor we're about to walk together. Feel the weight of your blanket like the weight of history settling over your shoulders. We're traveling backward now, not just through time, but through the eternal human experience of standing small before systems too large to see you, too powerful to care, too necessary to escape. Let me know in the comments what country and city you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you in bed already, letting these old sorrows carry away your modern worries? Are you in a different time zone, letting this story bridge the gap between your day and your dreams? I love knowing where this tale finds you, how many miles and years separate us from that bride who stood holding worthless coins and priceless tears. Only if this calms you, only if these gentle griefs ease your own harder ones, consider subscribing. No pressure, no urgency, just an invitation to join others who find peace in the knowledge that human frustration is ancient, universal, and somehow comforting in its consistency. Tonight, we're going to meet a citizen who carried 14 different complaints to the palace gates, 14 ways the system failed, 14 reasons to seek royal attention, 14 problems that sound remarkably like the ones we face today, just dressed in older clothes and speaking in older tongues. Her story begins where all such stories begin, with hope that refuses to die, even when bureaucracy does its best to kill it, with the stubborn human belief that somewhere, someone in power might actually listen, might actually care, might actually do something about the small cruelties that make ordinary life unnecessarily hard. The palace gates are opening. The night court is in session. And somewhere in that shadowy space between power and powerlessness, between citizen and state, between what is and what should be, justice waits to see if it remembers its own name. Let's go find out together. You stand before gates taller than your fears, older than your grandfather's memories, carved from stone that has witnessed empires rise and crumble like autumn leaves. The metal hinges groan with the weight of centuries, and somewhere in that ancient sound, you hear the echo of 10,000 other petitioners who stood exactly where you stand now, clutching their own impossible hopes, nursing their own bureaucratic wounds. The torches flicker against your face, casting shadows that dance like nervous thoughts across weathered stone. Each flame tells its own story of vigil. How many nights have people waited here? How many dawns have broken over desperate faces pressed against these gates? How many times has hope worn thin against the indifference of marble and mortar? The pie, smoke rises in thin ribbons, carrying prayers that have no official form, complaints that have no proper channel, dreams that have no bureaucratic category. You feel the weight of your documents against your chest, papers that represent months of preparation, years of suffering, a lifetime of trying to make sense of systems that seem designed to confuse rather than clarify. Each page represents a different wound. The dowry seized on your wedding morning, the water rights denied to your village, the merchant's license that costs more than a merchant can earn. These papers are your ammunition in a war you never chose to fight, your evidence in a trial where the rules change faster than you can learn them. The vizier approaches with footsteps that measure themselves against eternity. His silk robes whisper secrets as he moves, each fold catching torchlight like captured prayers. You watch his face, kind enough to offer hope, experienced enough to temper it, wise enough to know that power and justice dance together, but rarely in step. His hands, soft from years of handling documents instead of tools, gesture for you to follow. This is the moment when your small human story enters the vast machinery of state, when your personal grievances become official business, when your private pain seeks public remedy. Come, he says, and his voice carries the weight of procedure, the promise of process, the dangerous gift of official attention. The night court convenes, and His Majesty has agreed to hear your petition. These words should bring relief, but instead they bring a different kind of anxiety, the fear that your suffering, once spoken aloud in marble halls, might sound smaller than it feels, that your pain might seem ordinary when placed beside the grand concerns of governance. The corridors stretch ahead like frozen rivers of stone, lit by torches that cast more shadows than light. Each step echoes in ways that make you feel both significant and insignificant. Significant enough to be here, insignificant enough to wonder why. The walls themselves seem to lean in, listening to the soft scratch of your sandals against stone, the quiet rustle of your papers, the rapid beating of your heart that sounds too loud in spaces designed for whispers and weighty silences. You pass doorways that breathe with the presence of sleeping power, rooms where decisions are made that ripple outward like stones thrown in still water, affecting lives that will never know their source. Behind these doors, clerks work by candlelight, copying laws that will govern strangers, calculating taxes that will break families, drafting regulations that will birth new forms of bureaucratic misery. The machinery of state never sleeps, even when justice dozes. The year is lost to us now, swallowed by time's indifference to precise dates, but the grievances remain fresh as morning wounds. Perhaps this happened when your grandmother was young, or her grandmother, or in some eternal yesterday when human nature and governmental nature first learned to step on each other's toes. The specifics of time matter less than the timeless dance between citizen and state, between individual need and systemic indifference, between the human heart that seeks fairness and the administrative mind that seeks efficiency. You think of her, the bride whose story brought you here tonight, whose wedding dress still hangs in some historical closet, whose tears still stain documents that no longer exist but somehow still have power. Her disappointment echoes in these corridors, mingles with yours, becomes part of the eternal chorus of citizens who dared to hope that power might remember its purpose. These walls have heard 10,000 sorrows, absorbed them like stone absorbs rain, stored them in the space between marble blocks where justice and injustice press against each other like lovers who can never quite embrace. Every complaint that has ever been voiced in these halls has left its mark, invisible but permanent, creating a kind of acoustic memory that makes the palace itself a repository of human frustration transformed into formal petition. The vizier glances back at you, his expression unreadable in the dancing torchlight. Is that sympathy in his eyes? Or simply the professional kindness of someone who has shepherded countless petitioners through this same dark passage? Does he remember his own moments of powerlessness, or has proximity to power immunized him against the memory of what it feels like to need something from someone who has no obligation to provide it? Your footsteps sync with his, creating a rhythm that sounds almost like a heartbeat, almost like a prayer, almost like the eternal human march toward the hope that someone somewhere, in some position of authority, might actually listen. The torches ahead burn brighter, signaling approach to the throne room, where your small voice will attempt to reach ears accustomed to hearing the concerns of nations, where your individual suffering will compete for attention with the grand sweep of policy and precedent. The hush of power grows thicker with each step. This is the silence that surrounds decision makers, the quiet that cushions those who hold others' fates in their hands. It's different from the silence of common folk, heavier, more expectant, filled with the weight of consequences that stretch beyond the immediate moment into the vast web of cause and effect that governance creates. Somewhere ahead, a throne waits in darkness, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and accumulated indifference of ages. Somewhere ahead, power prepares to encounter powerlessness. Authority prepares to meet authenticity. The machinery of state prepares to confront the simple human request that it remember its original purpose, to serve those who serve it with their taxes, their loyalty, their stubborn faith that systems can be made to work for people instead of against them. The torch gutters, the hallway cools. Somewhere deeper, a new story sighs into existence, ready to unfold in the space between marble and moonlight, between citizen and sovereign, between the way things are and the way they ought to be. Hope tastes like wedding, cake turned to ash, like silk torn by rough hands, like promises written in water while laws are carved in stone. You remember that morning. How could you forget? When joy wore its finest dress and discovered that bureaucracy keeps its own calendar, unmarked by celebrations, uninterested in the human habit of marking special days with special mercy. The wedding morning began like a painting come to life. Silk ribbons caught the early light as if they had been waiting all night to shine. Grandmother's jewelry gleamed with the accumulated blessings of generations, and the white dress hung like captured moonlight, every thread a prayer for happiness, every fold a hope for the future. Your family moved through the house like dancers in a long-rehearsed ballet, mother braiding flowers that had been picked at dawn, father counting coins one final time with the satisfied smile of a man who had managed to provide exactly what tradition demanded, exactly what love deserved. The dowry sat in its wooden box like a promise made solid. Each coin had its own story. This one saved from market day when you chose bread over meat. That one earned by working extra hours when your neighbors needed help with harvest. Another set aside instead of buying the shoes you needed, because some things matter more than comfort. Copper and silver pieces that represented not just money, but sacrifice. Not just payment, but proof that love could transform itself into something the world would recognize. Something that would make your marriage not just a ceremony, but a transaction that society would honor and protect. Then came the 3 knocks, not the gentle tapping of well-wishers or the excited scratching of friends too eager to wait for invitation. 3 official knocks that sounded like Judgment Day, like the end of something beautiful before it had properly begun. 3 knocks that announced the arrival of efficiency into the realm of emotion, of calculation into the territory of celebration, of state business into the most private moment of human joy. The tax collector entered your house, like winter enters a garden, without permission, without apology, with the absolute confidence of authority that knows it will be obeyed simply, because it has declared itself worthy of obedience. His face wore the expression of someone performing a duty so familiar it had become automatic, someone who had learned to see coins and documents instead of dreams and disappointments, someone who measured human worth in terms of what could be officially assessed and legally seized. Unpaid taxes, he announced, as if these 2 words explained everything, justified everything, made reasonable the unreasonable intrusion of government accounting into private celebration. He spoke with the certainty of someone who had never had his own joy interrupted by official business, never watched his own special moments dissolve into paperwork and procedure, never learned that the state's memory for what you owe is far sharper than its memory for what it owes you. The dowry box opened like a wound, your months of careful saving, your family's sacrifices, your preparation for a future that suddenly seemed much less certain, all of it transformed in an instant from wedding gift to tax payment, from symbol of love to settlement of debt, from the foundation of your new life to the price of your old mistakes. Mistakes you weren't even sure you had made, debts you didn't remember accumulating, obligations that had somehow grown in the dark spaces of bureaucratic record-keeping like mushrooms in damp soil. A dowry is not a right, the collector said, repeating words that had clearly been spoken before, in other houses, to other families, on other days when celebration collided with administration. It is property, and property answers to the state before it answers to sentiment. The legal precision of his language felt like knives. Sharp, clean, designed to cut through emotional objection and reach the bone of official truth. Your mother wailed in the way that mothers have always wailed when their children's happiness becomes collateral damage in adult wars they never declared. The sound echoed through the house like breaking glass, sharp enough to cut through the collector's professional composure for just a moment before his training reasserted itself, before his face returned to the careful neutrality that bureaucrats wear like armor against the human consequences of their actions. The neighbors gathered in the courtyard, drawn by the commotion, but helpless to intervene. What could they do? Oppose the state on your behalf? Risk their own family's security for your moment of crisis? They stood in clusters, whispering prayers and sympathy in equal measure, offering the only support that was safe to give. Witness to injustice, memory of what happened when power encountered powerlessness and predictably emerged victorious. Your wedding dress waited upstairs, patient as any beautiful thing waiting to fulfill its purpose, unaware that its moment might never come, that the ceremony it was made for might be postponed indefinitely while you figured out how to rebuild what had been taken, how to start a marriage without the traditional foundation, how to explain to your intended that love would have to be enough because the practical expressions of commitment had been repurposed as tax revenue. The irony cut deeper than the loss itself. Here was a system supposedly designed to support social order, to create the stable structures within which families could flourish and communities could thrive. Yet it was destroying the very ceremonies that bound communities together, disrupting the rituals that transformed individual desire into social institution, treating the building blocks of civilization as nothing more than revenue opportunities. You think of marriages that began without dowries, loves that survived bureaucratic interference, ceremonies that proceeded despite official disruption. You think of the human capacity to find joy even when systems conspire against it, to create meaning even when institutions steal the traditional symbols of meaning, to make promises that no government can tax, offer commitments that no collector can seize, share hopes that no bureaucracy can reduce to entries in a ledger book. But you also think of relationships that couldn't survive such disruption, of couples whose love proved smaller than their social expectations, of families whose shame at failing to meet traditional obligations created wounds that never properly healed. You think of the hidden costs of bureaucratic efficiency, not just the money taken, but the trust eroded, the traditions disrupted, the simple human moments sacrificed to the great god of administrative convenience. The forms were filled out, in triplicate. Seals were pressed into wax with the gravity reserved for documents that would outlive the people they affected. Official language wrapped around your personal catastrophe like bandages around a wound, clean, efficient, designed to contain the bleeding without acknowledging the pain that caused it. The torch gutters in the palace corridor, its flame responding to drafts that move through these ancient halls like ghosts of old grievances. The complaint deepens as you walk, your story becoming part of the larger narrative of citizens who discovered that joy, no matter how pure, must answer to systems that measure everything except what matters most. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a bride still waits, dressed in hope and disappointment, ready to testify that love deserves better accounting than bureaucracy typically provides. Thirst is democracy's cruelest joke, the one need that makes philosophers of farmers and revolutionaries of grandmothers, who simply want to water their gardens without begging permission from strangers who have never touched soil, never felt the weight of empty buckets, never understood that water rights are human rights dressed in legal language. You remember when the village well belonged to everyone and no one, when children gathered there not just to draw water but to hear stories, when young couples carved their names into the wooden frame as naturally as rivers carve their paths through stone, when the only law that mattered was the ancient understanding that water, like air and sunlight, existed before governments and would continue flowing long after the last bureaucrat had filed his final form. The well stood at the center of everything, not just geographically, but spiritually, socially, economically. It was where news traveled faster than official messengers, where disputes were settled by people who knew each other's children's names, where the rhythm of daily life found its beat in the sound of bucket against stone, rope against wood, water against metal. 3 families had maintained it for generations, their grandfathers' grandfathers having dug it with tools passed down like family names, their labor mixed into the earth like prayers spoken in sweat and determination. Then came the surveyors, with their chains and calculations, their maps that reduced living community to geometric abstractions, their measurements that somehow transformed neighbors into legal adversaries and ancient agreements into invalid assumptions. They worked with the precision of people who had never relied on the things they were measuring, who had never waited anxiously for rain or rationed water during dry seasons, who saw liquid resources instead of life sources, property boundaries instead of community bonds. The new law arrived like a fever, suddenly, systemically, affecting everything at once. Water rights now required documentation that no one had ever thought to create, proof of agreements that had been sealed with handshakes rather than signatures, evidence of arrangements that had seemed as permanent as the stone foundation of the well itself. The bureaucrat's logic was unassailable in its narrowness. Show me the paper that proves your thirst. Demonstrate through official channels your need for something that falls freely from the sky. Your grandfather's handshake had meant everything to the men who shook it, but handshakes leave no trace in legal archives. create no entries in governmental databases, establish no precedent that courts can cite when determining who owns what, portions of something that, until recently, no one had imagined could be owned at all. 3 generations of mutual understanding dissolved overnight into a legal vacuum that only expensive lawyers could fill, only official procedures could resolve, only bureaucratic processes could legitimize. The village began to fracture along, lines invisible to everyone except the legal system. Families who had shared water for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of property disputes that none of them fully understood, but all of them were required to navigate. Children who had grown up together, whose parents had arranged their marriages, whose grandparents were buried in the same small cemetery, now found themselves inheriting feuds based on paperwork that contradicted everything they had learned about community, sharing, and the simple human obligation to help neighbors survive. The daily ritual transformed from community gathering to legal minefield. Every bucket drawn became a potential violation, every drink a possible trespass, every attempt to water crops or livestock a risk that could result in fines larger than most families earned in entire seasons. The well still produced the same sweet water it had always produced, but now that water carried the bitter taste of legal uncertainty, the metallic flavor of bureaucratic interference, the salt of tears shed by people who discovered that their most basic needs had become someone else's property to grant or deny. You watched neighbors who had once helped each other during harvest time, now standing guard over water sources like soldiers protecting military supplies. You saw children learning to carry buckets that weren't quite full because their parents weren't sure they had legal right to the final drops, learning to be thirsty because thirst was safer than the risk of official displeasure, learning that even the most basic human needs could become grounds for punishment if performed without proper authorization. The irony flowed like water seeking its level. Here was a system supposedly designed to protect property rights, creating a situation where the most fundamental property, the right to survive, became uncertain for everyone involved. Here was legal precision creating practical chaos, official clarity generating community confusion, governmental efficiency producing human inefficiency on a scale that would have been impossible without professional help. Water continued to follow the laws of physics even when human laws tried to redirect its flow. It still sought the lowest level, still responded to gravity rather than governmental decree, still evaporated and condensed according to natural cycles that operated without reference to legal calendars or administrative schedules. But human relationships proved more fragile than hydrological systems, more susceptible to disruption by forces that understood regulation better than they understood the delicate social ecology that made communities function. The appeals process became its own form of drought, expensive, time-consuming, emotionally exhausting, designed more to discourage petitioners than to resolve disputes. Forms that required information that didn't exist, fees that exceeded the value of the rights being disputed, waiting periods that stretched through growing seasons while crops withered and animals went thirsty, hearings scheduled for dates when farmers could least afford to leave their land unattended. You think of ancient civilizations that built their greatest cities around water sources, that understood instinctively what modern bureaucracy seems to have forgotten, that access to water is the foundation of everything else, that communities form around shared resources, not because of legal frameworks, but because of biological necessities, that the right to drink is older than the right to rule, and more fundamental than any governmental structure humans have ever devised. But you also think of solutions that emerged from this chaos. Neighbors who found ways to share, despite legal obstacles, communities that developed informal systems of mutual aid that operated beneath the radar of official attention. Families who discovered that cooperation could flow around bureaucratic barriers like water finding new channels when old ones are blocked. The law of unintended consequences proved more reliable than the laws written by legislators. Every attempt to clarify water rights created new forms of confusion. Every regulation designed to prevent conflict generated new sources of dispute. Every administrative solution spawned administrative problems that required additional administrative solutions in an endless cycle of bureaucratic reproduction. The village learned to live with legal uncertainty the way desert communities learn to live with water scarcity, carefully, creatively, with constant attention to resources that others take for granted. Children grew up understanding that simple acts could have complex legal implications, that basic human needs existed in a complicated relationship with governmental permission, that the gap between natural law and human law was wide enough to drown communities that fell into it. Water finds its level, following gravity toward the sea with patience that makes human urgency seem frantic by comparison. Grievances flow deeper, seeking their own level in the vast watershed of accumulated resentment that eventually reaches the palace, carrying with it the sediment of countless small injustices, the debris of broken community agreements, the dissolved minerals of trust that once held societies together but now make the water bitter for everyone who must drink it. Commerce breathes through a straw of permission, each inhalation monitored by clerks who have never kneaded dough or felt the satisfaction of feeding hungry neighbors, each exhalation taxed by officials who measure the worth of bread in forms and fees rather than in the simple human exchange of sustenance for survival, work for wages, skill for appreciation. The family bakery had existed for 3 generations without requiring anyone's permission, except the stomachs of people who needed bread and the hands willing to make it. Your grandfather's grandfather had learned the trade from his grandfather, who had learned it from a tradition so old it seemed to have emerged from the grain itself, as natural as wheat growing towards sunlight, as inevitable as hunger-seeking. Satisfaction as simple as the transformation of flour and water and fire into the foundation of civilized life. The ovens told their own story in layers of accumulated wisdom, temperature learned through decades of burned fingers and perfectly golden loaves, timing measured not by clocks, but by the sound dough makes when it's ready to become bread, quality, controlled not by bureaucratic standards, but by neighbors who returned day after day because your family's bread made their meals more than mere fuel, transformed their tables into gathering places, their kitchens into sanctuaries of shared satisfaction. 3 generations of reputation, built one loaf at a time, one satisfied customer at a time, one day at a time of rising before dawn to light. Fires that would warm more than ovens, that would create the daily miracle of flour transformed into nourishment, of simple ingredients combined with skill and care to produce something greater than the sum of its parts. Your hands knew this work, like your heart knew how to beat, automatically, efficiently, with the unconscious competence that comes only from years of practice, guided by love of craft. Then came the guild system, like winter coming early, like a bureaucratic ice age that froze the natural flow of commerce into rigid channels controlled by people who understood regulation better than they understood bread, who knew more about market manipulation than they knew about the simple satisfaction of feeding families who depended on your skill to supplement their own survival strategies. The new regulations arrived in language so complex, it seemed designed, more to confuse than to clarify, more to exclude than to include, more to protect existing interests than to ensure quality or safety or any of the stated goals that politicians used to justify transforming the marketplace from a community resource into a controlled environment where permission mattered more than performance, where credentials trumped competence, where the right to work required approval from people who had never worked in the ways they were now authorized to regulate. You need a license, they said. as if these 4 words explained everything, as if the obvious necessity of official permission was self-evident to anyone with sense enough to understand how civilized society operated, as if 3 generations of successful bread-making counted for nothing compared to a single piece of paper issued by people who had never successfully baked anything more complex than their own bureaucratic procedures. The license cost more than your family earned in a good month, required forms that asked questions about aspects of baking that seemed irrelevant to anyone who actually baked, demanded fees that seemed designed more to generate revenue than to ensure competence, and created a legal framework that transformed neighbors into competitors, fellow craftsmen into potential violators. The simple act of making bread into a privilege granted by strangers rather than a skill shared within communities. The catch-22 revealed itself with mathematical precision. You needed money to get the license, but you needed the license to make money. But you couldn't make money without the license, but you couldn't get the license without money. The circular logic was perfect in its impossibility, elegant in its exclusion of anyone who didn't already possess the resources necessary to navigate systems designed by and for people who had never faced the choice between feeding their families and following regulations. Your regular customers, the widow who bought day-old bread because it was all she could afford, the young couple saving for their own wedding who splurged on fresh rolls for Sunday breakfast, the children who pressed their noses against your window and knew that the smell of baking bread meant their neighborhood was still home to someone, who cared about their hunger. These people didn't care about licenses and guild memberships and official authorizations. They cared about bread that tasted like home, that cost what they could afford, that was available when they needed it. But the law cared about different things. The law cared about market control disguised as quality assurance, about revenue generation presented as consumer protection, about creating artificial scarcity in the name of maintaining standards that had nothing to do with the actual quality of actual bread and everything to do with limiting competition for established bakeries that could afford to pay for the privilege of excluding others from their market. We need dough, not influence, you told the guild representative. But your wordplay fell on ears trained to hear only the language of compliance and violation, of authorized and unauthorized, of legal and illegal. Your hands, scarred from years of working with hot ovens and sharp tools, meant nothing compared to hands that had learned to hold pens and stamps and seals, that had never been burned by honest work, but wielded the power to burn others through legal channels. The community began to fracture along economic lines that had nothing to do with the quality of bread or the needs of hungry families. Established bakeries that could afford guild membership found themselves protected from competition, not by superior skill or better service, but by bureaucratic barriers that excluded anyone without sufficient capital to purchase permission to work. New bakers with talent, but no money, discovered that skill meant nothing without official recognition, that the ability to transform grain into sustenance was worthless without the ability to transform money into licenses. Your neighbors faced a choice between supporting local businesses they had relied on for years and obeying laws that criminalized their most basic economic relationships. They watched helplessly as family businesses that had anchored their community for generations were forced to close, not because they had failed to serve their customers, but because they had failed to satisfy bureaucrats who had never tasted their bread, never relied on their service, never understood the difference between feeding people and feeding systems. The guild meetings revealed themselves as theaters of predetermined outcomes, performances where established interests made shows of considering applications from aspiring bakers while actually protecting their own market shares from competition that might force them to justify their prices, improve their quality, or demonstrate that their success was based on merit rather than on legal barriers to entry. You think of bread rising despite regulations, of yeast that transforms flour according to natural laws that no bureaucracy can alter, of hunger that operates according to biological schedules that don't recognize business hours or licensing requirements. You think of communities that found ways to share skills and resources beneath the attention of officials who were more interested in controlling commerce than in ensuring that commerce served community needs. Bread rises despite the law, following ancient chemical processes that predate government and will outlast bureaucracy. Hope kneads itself into tomorrow, patient as dough, persistent as hunger, confident that human needs will eventually find ways to satisfy themselves, regardless of the obstacles that human systems create to make survival more complicated than it needs to be. Death's paperwork outlives the dead, accumulating in dusty files long after the hearts that generated the disputes have stopped beating, long after the love that motivated the promises has been forgotten by everyone except the legal system, which remembers debts more clearly than it remembers devotion, which preserves conflicts more carefully than it preserves the relationships that made those conflicts possible in the first place. Your father's deathbed looked like every deathbed, too small for the weight of everything that needed to be said, too quiet for the magnitude of what was ending, too ordinary for the extraordinary act of a human life reaching its conclusion. He lay there, surrounded by the accumulation of 60 years of living. Family photographs that captured moments of happiness now existing only in memory. Tools worn smooth by decades of honest work. Books that had shaped his thinking. And most importantly, the quiet presence of children who had learned from his example how to live with dignity, even when life offered more challenges than rewards. His promises were made in the ancient currency of trust, spoken in the language that families had always used to transfer not just property, but responsibility, not just possessions, but the obligation to care for those who could no longer care for themselves. The house goes to your sister, he whispered, because she needs it most. The land goes to your brother because he knows how to work it. The savings go to your mother because she earned them by taking care of all of us. Simple words that carried the weight of a lifetime's observation, a father's final attempt to distribute fairness in a world that had never been particularly fair to his family. These deathbed whispers meant everything to the people who heard them, and nothing to the clerks, who would eventually be asked to process them. Love leaves no official trace in governmental databases, creates no entries in legal archives, establishes no precedent that courts can cite when families dissolve into factions over property that once seemed to belong to everyone and no one. Simultaneously, the state demands signatures on documents, witnesses who can testify under oath, evidence that meets legal standards of proof, none of which seemed necessary when what was being transferred was not just property, but the continuation of family relationships, the preservation of bonds that property was supposed to serve rather than define. Your father died believing that his word was his bond, that promises made in love would be honored by people who had received that love, that family loyalty was stronger than legal technicality. He died in a simpler world than the one his death would create. A world where oral tradition carried the same weight as written contracts, where character mattered more than credentials, where the people who knew him best were automatically the most qualified to interpret his final wishes. But death transforms everything, including the people who survive it. Grief has strange effects on practical judgment, makes previously reasonable people suddenly uncertain about arrangements that had seemed perfectly clear when the person who made them was alive to explain and defend and clarify. What had been family understanding became family dispute. What had been obvious became ambiguous. What had been settled became the source of conflicts that would outlast the love that had originally motivated the careful distribution of resources. among people who were supposed to take care of each other. The missing witness proved to be the fulcrum on which everything balanced. Your father's closest friend, the man who had stood beside him through decades of shared labor and mutual support, the only person outside the family who truly understood the reasoning behind the final arrangements. He had died 6 months earlier, taking with him the testimony that might have prevented years of legal proceedings, family estrangement, and the transformation of inheritance from gift to battlefield. One signature away from justice, one voice away from peace, one piece of documentation away from the resolution that would have allowed everyone to grieve properly, instead of channeling their grief into legal proceedings that treated family relationships like business partnerships, emotional bonds like contractual obligations, a father's love like a corporate restructuring that required official approval to become effective. Your siblings, who had grown up sharing toys and chores and dreams, now found themselves on opposite sides of legal proceedings that reduced their childhood home to a dispute over property rights, their father's farm to a question of title transfer, their mother's security to a matter of probate law. Lawyers who had never met your father felt qualified to interpret his intentions based on incomplete paperwork, to assign motives to a dead man who could no longer defend himself, to reduce a lifetime of family relationships to arguments about who deserved what, according to legal precedents established by strangers dealing with their own family disputes. The irony cut deeper than the loss itself. Here was a system supposedly designed to protect family interests, creating a situation that destroyed family relationships. A legal framework intended to ensure fairness, generating unfairness on a scale that would have been impossible without professional legal assistance. A probate process that processed everything except the love that had motivated the original arrangements. Your mother, who had spent 40 years learning your father's opinions, who could predict his reactions to situations he had never encountered, who understood his values better than he understood them himself, found her lifetime of intimate knowledge dismissed as legally irrelevant compared to documents that captured only fragments of intentions that were too complex and too rooted in relationship to be adequately expressed in the language that courts required as evidence. Oral tradition died with your father, but the need for interpretation survived. Family stories that had provided context for his decisions became inadmissible hearsay in legal proceedings that treated memory like contaminated evidence, that valued official documentation over personal knowledge, that assumed written records, were more reliable than the recollections of people who had actually lived through the experiences being documented. The legal fees accumulated like compound interest, eating away at the estate that was supposed to provide security for your mother's remaining years, transforming inheritance from blessing to burden, from your father's final gift to your mother's ongoing financial nightmare. Lawyers got rich arguing about the distribution of wealth that was disappearing into their own pockets, while families got poor fighting over resources that were shrinking with every motion filed, every deposition taken, every hearing scheduled. You think of promises that survive the people who made them, of love that transcends legal technicalities, of families that found ways to honor their dead despite the obstacles that legal systems created to make honoring the dead more expensive and complicated than it needed to be. You think of the difference between legal inheritance and moral inheritance, between what the law requires and what love deserves, between official documentation and spiritual continuation. The courtroom felt like a church where the wrong prayers were being offered, where strangers interpreted sacred texts written in a language of relationship that they had never learned to speak, where the rituals of legal procedure replaced the rituals of family mourning, where your father's final wishes became evidence in proceedings that treated his lifetime of wisdom as legally irrelevant compared to the presence or absence of properly executed documents. Memory fades like old photographs, but documents yellow. with age in files that outlast the people they were supposed to serve. The heart keeps its own records, maintains its own archives, preserves its own evidence of promises made in love and intended to be honored by people who understood that some obligations transcend legal enforcement because they arise from bonds that no court can create and no legal proceeding can adequately dissolve. Peace costs more than war, at least for families who discover that avoiding military service requires payments that exceed the wages soldiers earn, that staying home to tend fields and care for aging parents and maintain the local economy demands tribute that makes combat seem like the more economical option, that the privilege of not risking your life for your country must be purchased from a government that profits from both patriotism and its absence. Your son represents more than just another potential soldier in the king's army. He represents the difference between a farm that continues to feed the community and fields that lie fallow, while their caretaker marches toward horizons he never wanted to see, between parents who age gracefully with help nearby and parents who age alone, while their child serves strangers in foreign territories, between local knowledge passed from father to son and traditions that die when the chain of transmission is broken by military obligations that serve national interests at the expense of family continuity. The mathematics of agricultural life operate according to seasonal rhythms that don't coordinate with military schedules, biological cycles that don't recognize governmental priorities, harvesting requirements that don't accommodate the timing of royal campaigns. Planting happens when soil conditions are right, not when army recruiters find it convenient. Harvesting happens when crops are ready, not when military training schedules allow for agricultural leave. Animals need daily care that doesn't respect. The demands of national defense and aging parents require assistance that can't be postponed until military service is completed. One son, 2 hands, 40 acres of responsibility, and the knowledge that removing any element from this equation transforms productive farmland into abandoned property, thriving family business into failed economic experiment, community stability into local chaos that ripples outward like stones thrown into still water. Take the son, kill the farm, destroy the family, weaken the community, but somehow strengthen the nation that depends on strong communities to provide the foundation for everything else, including the military that threatens to undermine its own support structure. The ancient agreements seemed clear enough when they were negotiated by people who understood both military necessity and agricultural reality, who recognized that armies need to be fed by farms that need to be worked by farmers, who need to be present to do the work that feeds the armies, that protect the farms, that feed the people, who provide the sons who serve in the armies. The circular logic made sense to everyone except administrators who had learned to see each component in isolation, rather than as part of an interconnected system where every action generated consequences that eventually circled back to affect the original decision makers. Your village had contributed to national defense for generations through a carefully negotiated arrangement that recognized local service as equivalent to military service, maintaining roads that armies would travel, producing food that soldiers would eat, training horses that cavalry would ride, smithing weapons that warriors would carry. This local contribution to national security seemed more practical than removing productive citizens from productive work to train them for destruction that everyone hoped would never be necessary. But military quotas operate according to bureaucratic logic that counts bodies rather than contributions, that measures patriotism by willingness to leave home rather than by willingness to support home. That assumes national service means military service, even when non-military service serves national interests more effectively. The quota system transformed citizens into numbers on spreadsheets, reduced complex human lives to simple mathematical equations, treated families like inventory to be managed rather than communities to be preserved. The mayor's promise carried the weight of local knowledge and community relationships. But mayor's promises proved lighter than royal demands when weighed on scales calibrated by distant authorities who had never visited your village, never understood your local economy, never recognized that different communities might serve national interests through different forms of contribution. Local officials who understood the human cost of their decisions found themselves overruled by central authorities who understood only the administrative convenience of uniform policies applied without regard for local circumstances. The recruitment. Officer arrived with documents that transformed your son from irreplaceable family member to interchangeable military resource, that reduced his lifetime of local knowledge to a few lines of demographic data, that treated his agricultural skills as irrelevant compared to his potential for learning military skills that might never be used, but would certainly interrupt the practical skills that were being used every day to maintain the economic foundation, that supported everything else, including the military that wanted to claim him. Every family sacrifices for the kingdom, the officer explained, as if this obvious truth settled all questions about fairness, as if the equal distribution of sacrifice automatically created just outcomes, as if taking sons from families that couldn't afford to lose them served national interests better than taking sons from families that could easily spare them. Mathematical equality applied to unequal situations created new forms of inequality that seemed designed to punish communities for being too successful at taking care of themselves without governmental assistance. The alternative tax revealed the true nature of the system. This was never about military necessity or national defense or patriotic obligation. This was about revenue generation disguised as civic duty, about creating situations where families would pay premiums to avoid disruptions that served no military purpose, about transforming the threat of unwanted service into a profit center that generated income while providing nothing in return except the absence of interference with productive activities that were already serving community and national interests. Blood money for staying home, payments for the privilege of continuing to contribute to society through civilian means, tribute for the right to maintain family relationships and community responsibilities and economic activities that were more valuable to national welfare than military training that prepared young men for wars that might never happen while preventing them from doing agricultural work that needed to happen every season without interruption. The moral complexity deepened with every conversation. Was this patriotism with a price tag or practical resource management that recognized different forms of national service? Was this corruption that allowed wealthy families to buy their way out of military obligations, or sensible policy that kept productive citizens engaged in productive activities? Was this fair taxation that spread the burden of national defense across the entire community, or extortion that profited from family bonds and community relationships? Your neighbors faced similar calculations with different variables. The blacksmith whose skills were needed locally but whose strength would serve the army, the miller whose expertise fed the community but whose absence would create food shortages, the teacher whose knowledge educated local children but whose intelligence might benefit military planning. Each family weighed individual sacrifice against community need, personal loyalty against national obligation, immediate costs against long-term consequences. The village council meetings became exercises in collective moral reasoning, attempts to balance competing loyalties and conflicting responsibilities, efforts to find solutions that served both local interests and national requirements without destroying either. These discussions revealed the inadequacy of policies designed by people who had never faced the choices they were requiring others to make, who understood military needs without understanding civilian needs, who assumed that national service and community service were competing rather than complementary forms of civic contribution. Some families paid the tax and kept their sons, creating guilt about privilege purchased at the expense of families who couldn't afford such payments. Other families sent their sons to serve, creating resentment about obligations that seemed to fall disproportionately on people who could least afford the disruption. A few families tried to hide their sons, creating fear about legal consequences that were severe enough to destroy lives even when military service might not. The army ultimately got its quota through a combination of volunteers, conscripts, and purchased exemptions, but the community paid prices that weren't measured in the official accounting: disrupted families, abandoned farms, weakened local economy, damaged social fabric, and the corrosive knowledge that civic obligations could be transformed into business opportunities for governments that understood the market value of coercion better than they understood the social value of keeping communities intact. Seasons turn with indifference to human scheduling, following rhythms established before governments existed and destined to continue after current political arrangements become historical curiosities. Armies march according to strategic necessities that rarely coordinate with agricultural requirements, leaving communities to balance competing loyalties with inadequate resources and impossible choices. Fields remember the hands that fed them, preserve the knowledge that was passed from father to son, hold space for the sons who might return and the sons who never will, waiting with the patience that only soil possesses for the restoration of relationships that military service interrupted but never completely severed. Faith speaks in whispers, law shouts in decrees, and somewhere in the space between divine commandments and royal proclamations, ordinary people discover that serving God and serving government require different calendars, different loyalties, different definitions of what constitutes sacred obligation versus civic duty, different understandings of which authority deserves precedence when earthly and heavenly demands conflict in ways that seem designed to test both political allegiance and spiritual commitment. Your community had organized its entire rhythm around religious observances that were older than the kingdom itself, that had provided structure and meaning through countless generations of births and deaths and seasonal cycles, that had created bonds between neighbors and connections between past and future that seemed as permanent as the mountains that surrounded your valley, as reliable as the sunrise that marked each new day of worship and work, integrated into a seamless pattern of daily devotion. The Sabbath wasn't just a day of rest, it was the heartbeat around which all other activities organized themselves, the pause that gave meaning to motion, the silence that gave significance to sound, the emptiness that gave value to fullness. 6 days of labor made sense because they pointed toward 1 day of reflection. 6 days of worldly concerns balanced by 1 day of spiritual attention. 6 days of serving human needs crowned by 1 day of acknowledging divine presence that made all human activity meaningful rather than merely mechanical. But tax collection operates according to bureaucratic schedules that recognize efficiency more readily than they recognize eternity, that measure productivity in terms of revenue generated rather than souls nourished, that assume governmental needs take precedence over religious obligations, because governmental authority is immediate and concrete, while religious authority seems abstract and deferrable, at least to administrators who have learned to quantify everything except the unquantifiable aspects of human experience that make quantification seem inadequate. God rests, but the state never sleeps, the tax collector announced, as if this theological observation settled all questions about scheduling conflicts, as if divine precedent was irrelevant to human policy, as if the same authority that created time itself had no legitimate claim on how time should be used by people who believed that their ultimate accountability was to powers higher than political powers, older than governmental institutions, more permanent than any earthly arrangement for organizing social relationships. The holy day obligations weren't arbitrary preferences that could be adjusted for administrative convenience. They were commandments that carried the weight of eternal significance, practices that connected your community to traditions that stretched back through centuries of faithful observance, rituals that maintained relationships not just between people, but between people and the divine source that gave meaning to all. Human relationships, including the relationship between citizen and state. Your congregation faced an impossible choice between obeying religious law and obeying civil law, between honoring sacred commitments and meeting secular obligations, between maintaining spiritual integrity and avoiding legal penalties that were severe enough to destroy lives, families, and the economic foundation that supported the religious community itself. This wasn't a conflict between competing preferences. This was a collision between fundamental loyalties that seemed designed to test whether faith was strong enough to survive governmental pressure. The community gathered in emergency session, filling the meeting house with whispered prayers and anxious discussions, with appeals to scriptural precedent and practical considerations, with the desperate creativity of people trying to find solutions that honored both divine commands and royal decrees without betraying either commitment or inviting persecution that could destroy everything they had built together over generations of shared sacrifice and mutual support. Some families proposed paying the tax under protest, preserving their legal standing while maintaining their spiritual objection, treating the payment as tribute to Caesar while keeping their hearts focused on serving God, finding ways to comply with governmental requirements without compromising religious principles that seemed more important than money, even when money became necessary for protecting the community that made religious observance possible. Other families insisted that any compromise with sacred obligations was spiritual betrayal that would corrupt the entire community, that paying taxes collected on holy days was participation in the desecration of sacred time, that faithful people should be willing to accept legal consequences rather than participate in governmental policies that violated divine law, even when those consequences included imprisonment, property seizure, and the destruction of families that were trying to serve God faithfully in an increasingly hostile environment. The village priest found himself caught between pastoral care and prophetic responsibility, between protecting his congregation from governmental retaliation and protecting their souls from spiritual compromise, between the practical wisdom that counseled accommodation and the scriptural principles that demanded resistance, between his role as community leader who wanted to preserve the church and his calling as spiritual guide, who was supposed to help people navigate conflicts between earthly and heavenly authorities. The tax collection schedule seemed almost deliberately designed to create maximum conflict with religious observances, as if administrators were testing the strength of spiritual commitment, measuring the relative power of sacred and secular authority, determining whether religious communities would choose legal compliance or theological consistency when forced to choose between incompatible obligations that couldn't be satisfied simultaneously. Sunday morning transformed from celebration to crisis, from community gathering to community dividing, from shared worship to shared anxiety about consequences that would flow from whatever choice the congregation made about paying taxes that were due immediately, but collected on days when financial transactions violated religious law that was older and more authoritative than any governmental regulation, at least according to people whose ultimate loyalty was to eternal rather than temporal powers. The theological complexity deepened with every attempt to find middle ground between competing authorities that seemed determined to avoid accommodation, that appeared to be testing the limits of religious tolerance in a society that claimed to respect spiritual diversity, while implementing policies that made spiritual observance practically difficult and legally dangerous. How could faithful people serve God while serving government, when service to each seemed to require betrayal of the other? Your neighbors struggled with questions that had no easy answers, with choices that seemed designed to create lose-lose situations, with conflicts that revealed the inadequacy of any simple formula for balancing competing loyalties that were both legitimate and mutually exclusive. Some families left the community rather than face the choice, seeking places where religious observance didn't conflict with civic obligations. Other families stayed and paid the penalty for faithfulness, accepting legal consequences as the price of spiritual integrity. The broader community watched nervously as religious families faced persecution for practicing beliefs that had been tolerated for generations, wondering whether today's religious freedom would become tomorrow's legal liability, whether spiritual diversity would survive governmental policies that seemed designed to create uniformity through economic pressure rather than through direct prohibition that would be more obviously oppressive, but also more clearly illegitimate. Church and state discovered that separation was easier to proclaim than to practice, that theoretical distinctions became practically complicated when both institutions claimed authority over the same people at the same times for purposes that seemed equally legitimate but proved mutually exclusive, that religious liberty and civic obligation could conflict in ways that damaged both religious communities and governmental legitimacy. Prayer rises like incense, carrying hopes and fears toward heaven with the patience of people who understand that divine justice operates according to schedules that don't coordinate with human urgency, that spiritual solutions might take longer to manifest than legal problems take to develop, that faith requires persistence through conflicts that test both individual commitment and community solidarity. Grievances settle like dust in the palace corridors, accumulating evidence of the difficulty that governments face when they try to regulate the relationship between citizens and eternity, when they attempt to schedule the sacred according to the convenience of the secular, when they discover that some human loyalties transcend political control, because they point toward authorities that existed before governments and will continue after current political arrangements, become historical memories preserved in the prayers of people who chose faithfulness over legal compliance when forced to choose between obligations that both seemed sacred until they proved incompatible. Lines on maps divide more than land. You watch as the surveyor arrives at dawn, his chains and measuring tools catching the first light like silver snakes awakening. The metal links clink softly against each other as he unfurls them across ground that has known the same footsteps for 3 generations, the same prayers whispered at sunrise, the same children's laughter echoing through seasons of plenty and want. You feel the tension in the air, thick as morning mist rising from earth that remembers every blessing and every tear shed upon its surface. The old man's voice trembles as he points to the fence his grandfather built with hands that knew every grain of this wood, every post driven deep with hope for future harvests. My grandfather's fence says otherwise, he whispers, but his words carry the weight of decades, the authority of memory passed down like family silver from one generation to the next. You see how his weathered hands trace the wooden posts, each one a memory crystallized in timber, each one a promise made when handshakes carried more weight than signatures, when a man's word was worth more than the paper it might have been written upon. The surveyor's map tells a different story, drawn in precise ink and measured ambition, calculated with instruments that know nothing of the soil they measure or the hearts they divide. His compass points true north, but cannot find the direction of justice. His chains measure distance, but cannot gauge the length of belonging, the depth of roots that have grown into earth that welcomed them decades before any official document acknowledged their right to exist here. You understand how property lines create enemies from friends, how invisible boundaries become visible wounds that never quite heal. Yesterday, These families shared harvests when drought threatened everyone's survival, helped raise each other's barns when community meant more than competition, celebrated weddings and mourned losses together as if blood connected what geography merely separated. Today, they stand on opposite sides of an invisible line that exists more on paper than in the living earth beneath their feet, more in the surveyor's imagination than in the reality of shared seasons and mutual dependence. The official map has redrawn reality with the casual arrogance of those who confuse measurement with truth, precision with justice. You feel the sadness of community torn apart by bureaucratic accuracy that measures everything except the human cost of its own precision. Neighbors who once borrowed sugar and lent tools now calculate property values and hire lawyers. Their children learning to see boundaries where their grandparents saw endless possibility. Watch how the orchards are split, their ancient roots knowing nothing of human boundaries, their underground networks of communication and nourishment continuing. Conversations that surface politics have forgotten how to conduct. Apple trees that have grown together for 50 years now belong to different owners, according to documents filed last month, their branches intertwining above a line that divides their fruit between families who no longer speak except through attorneys who charge by the hour for translating neighbors' quarrels into legal language. You taste the bitterness of harvests divided, of shared labor now measured and portioned, according to documents that arrived last Tuesday bearing official seals and threatening deadlines. Fruit that ripened under the same sun, watered by the same rain, tended by hands that learned their skill from the same grandfather, now carries different prices depending on which side of an invisible line claims ownership of trees that predate the very concept of individual property. The earth knows no lines. You realize as you observe this scene unfold like a tragedy written in surveyor's ink. Seasons turn the same on both sides of every fence, bringing spring equally to land owned and land disputed. Summer heat that recognizes no boundaries except those created by shadow and elevation. Rain falls without consulting surveys, without checking documentation, blessing and flooding with the same democratic indifference that nature has always shown toward human attempts at organization. But legal precision has carved through living memory like a blade through silk, creating feuds that will outlast the original dispute. Wounds that will heal into scars passed down like reluctant inheritances to children who will learn to hate before they learn the reason for hatred. Young ones will inherit these divisions along with the land itself, learning to see enemies where their grandparents saw extended family, competition where previous generations found cooperation. The surveyor packs his tools as the sun climbs. Higher, his work complete, but its consequences just beginning. He leaves behind communities forever changed by the weight of official measurements, by the authority of instruments that can calculate distance but cannot measure belonging, that can draw lines but cannot heal the wounds those lines create. His chains fold neatly into his leather case, but the boundaries they have established will stretch across generations, dividing more than land, separating more than property. You witness how boundaries blur in moonlight, how darkness returns the land to its original wholeness, erasing the artificial divisions that daylight and paperwork insist upon creating. The land dreams of wholeness, while humans argue over fragments, while lawyers calculate billable hours from disputes that started with good intentions and ended with broken communities. Night heals what day divides, but dawn will return tomorrow with the same surveyor's chains, the same official documents, the same human tendency to measure what cannot be measured and divide what was meant to remain whole. Roads connect, but tariffs divide. You follow the merchant caravan as it winds through mountain passes carved by centuries of commerce, each step forward, accompanied by the familiar music of trade, the jingle of coins counted and recounted, the creak of wooden wheels bearing more hope than their axles were designed to carry, the soft conversations between traders who measure, their success in copper pieces and their failures in dreams deferred. The silk merchant counts his remaining funds with increasing anxiety, his calloused fingers working through calculations that grow more desperate with each approaching checkpoint. 3 times he will pay tax on the same bolt of silk, you realize, with growing outrage at the mathematical certainty of this bureaucratic multiplication. 3 different collectors will examine the same goods with the practiced eye of those who have learned to find value in everything except fairness. Stamp the same papers with seals that mean nothing except the right to extract payment, and take their portion of what was once a reasonable profit, turned gradually into an impossible dream, through the simple arithmetic of accumulated official greed. The morning checkpoint approaches like a storm cloud on an otherwise clear horizon. You watch the toll collectors at their stations, hands extended with the certainty of those who control the only path forward. Their authority as absolute as geography itself. Each bridge becomes a bottleneck of bureaucracy. Each gate a wallet with official permission to empty other wallets. Each border crossing a reminder that freedom of movement carries a price calculated by those who never move anywhere except between their counting houses and their comfortable beds. The silk merchant's ledger tells the story in fading ink that grows fainter as his profits disappear into the collector's strongboxes. By the time silk reaches market, it's worth its weight in fees, he calculates with the bitter precision of a man watching his children's future converted into other men's present comfort. His stylus wears thin against the papyrus, worn down by calculations that never balance in his favor, numbers that always favor the house, the state, the system that has turned trade into tribute. You observe how luxury becomes impossibility through the simple accumulation of official demands that compound like interest on debt that cannot be repaid. What began as trade, as the noble human impulse to share abundance across distance, becomes extraction, becomes a system designed to ensure that those who create value receive less of it than those who merely tax its passage from one place to another. The consumer impact ripples outward, like stones thrown in still water, creating waves that reach shores the tax collectors never see, and would not care about if they did. The weaver's wife will go without new cloth this season, her hands working with threads grown rough from too many washings, her dreams of beauty postponed indefinitely by mathematics she cannot control. The merchant's own daughter will wear last year's wedding dress, her special day diminished by the accumulation of other people's special claims on her father's honest profits. Beauty spreads only as far as bureaucratic generosity allows, which is to say, not very far at all, creating artificial scarcity in a world capable of natural abundance. You see how economic philosophy has twisted into practice, how the simple human desire to improve life through commerce has been transformed into a system that punishes improvement and rewards extraction, that makes luxury of necessity and impossibility, of dreams. International trade carries whispers of distant justice. You notice as conversations drift between the wagons like smoke from evening cooking fires. In far lands, merchants speak of routes where goods flow freely, like water finding its natural level, where bridges connect rather than collect, where roads welcome the dreams they carry instead of taxing them into smaller and smaller versions of themselves. These stories pass between traders like secret prayers, like promises of possibility that sustain hope through the mathematics of present impossibility. But here, in this kingdom, economic barriers manufacture scarcity from abundance, with the mechanical precision of mills that grind grain into flour. Except these mills grind dreams into dust and hope into resignation. The system has learned to create artificial shortage in the midst of natural plenty, to make rare what should be common, expensive what should be accessible, impossible what should be merely difficult. The silk merchant adjusts his remaining inventory as evening approaches, calculating not just profit and loss, but the human cost of a system that has forgotten its original purpose. Trade was meant to connect communities across impossible distances, to make the world smaller and more generous, to allow the abundance of one region to supply the needs of another. Instead, it has become a mechanism for ensuring that abundance serves only those with the authority to tax its passage. You feel the weight of this realization settling over the caravan like evening mist. The understanding that commerce has been captured by those who contribute nothing to its creation, but everything to its restriction. The traders make camp knowing that tomorrow will bring more checkpoints, more collectors, more calculations that favor everyone except those who actually create the value being calculated. Trade winds carry more than goods, you realize as night settles over the caravan like a blanket woven from starlight and possibility. They whisper of distant justice, of markets where merit matters more than paperwork, where value flows to those who create it rather than those who merely intercept it, where roads serve travelers instead of serving those who tax the privilege of travel. These whispers sustain the merchants through the long night, promising that somewhere, somehow, commerce remembers its original purpose of connecting human need with human abundance, of making the world more generous rather than more extractive. Skill seeks no permission, but craft requires approval. You enter the workshop where candles burn long into the night, their wavering light casting dancing shadows across tools that know the weight of dreams deferred and talent constrained by artificial tradition. The young craftsman works with the concentrated intensity of natural ability trapped within artificial boundaries, his hands moving with the certainty of skill that needs no validation except the perfection it creates from raw wood and honest intention. His carvings speak in wood grain and flowing curves, each piece an argument for excellence over regulation, beauty over bureaucracy, merit over monopoly. You feel the creative frustration radiating from every precise cut, every perfect joint that cannot legally exist until 7 papers bearing official seals grant permission for talent to express itself in forms that please those who have never held a chisel or understood the conversation between craftsman and material. The guildmasters protect mediocrity like shepherds guarding sheep, their own skills grown comfortable with the protection that monopoly provides against the uncomfortable challenge of genuine competition. New techniques threaten old profits. They whisper among themselves during meetings held in rooms where innovation goes to die, where the phrase, "We've always done it this way," carries more weight than demonstrations of superior craftsmanship or more efficient methods. You observe how innovation suffocates under the weight of apprenticeship economics, where 7 years must pass before talent earns the right to compete with technique, where natural ability must wait for bureaucratic permission to express itself in marketplace realities. The guild system has transformed learning from exploration into endurance, from discovery into patience, from creativity into compliance with regulations written by those who fear what they cannot control. His hands knew what his papers couldn't. Prove you understand as you watch him work by flickering candlelight, his fingers reading the wood grain like scholars read ancient texts, finding the hidden beauty waiting inside each piece of timber like promises waiting inside possibilities. Quality battles access in this workshop, where excellence reserves itself for the connected while ordinary needs go unmet, where superior craftsmanship hides behind regulatory barriers that serve everyone except those who need the furniture, the tools, the beautiful objects that skilled hands could create if permission were not required for perfection. The guild creates artificial scarcity in abundant times, limiting chairs and tables and bowls as if wood itself were precious beyond measure rather than the renewable gift of forests that grow more generous each season. Market manipulation has mathematics all its own, calculations that multiply profits for the few by dividing opportunities for the many, arithmetic that counts money more carefully than it counts talent, that measures influence more precisely than it measures ability. Fewer craftsmen means higher prices, means greater profits for those who control the gates of permission. You realize as you witness this economic alchemy that transforms scarcity into gold while leaving genuine need unmet and genuine skill unemployed. The system has learned to create shortage from abundance, to manufacture waiting lists from willing hands, to turn the natural human desire for beautiful, functional objects into a privilege reserved for those who can afford the tribute that monopoly demands. Creative frustration builds like water behind a dam, pressure growing with each rejected application, each fee demanded for the privilege of proving worthiness to judges who have forgotten what worthiness looks like when it's not stamped with official approval. You feel this pressure accumulating in the workshop, like storm clouds gathering before thunder, like spring floods building behind winter ice that must eventually break under the weight of what it cannot forever contain. The young man's latest piece catches torchlight like trapped sunlight, its curves flowing with the natural grace that wood possesses when liberated by hands that understand its hidden possibilities. Beauty finds a way, you realize, like water through stone. Creativity seeps through the cracks of even the most rigid system. Talent refuses to be permanently constrained by those who mistake regulation for wisdom, control for competence. Guild. Meetings drone on in distant chambers where men who have not touched tools in decades decide the fate of those whose hands speak daily with materials they understand better than the officials understand the regulations they impose. You see how bureaucracy has captured craftsmanship, how the human instinct to create has been subordinated to the institutional instinct to control, how the guild system has forgotten its original purpose of maintaining standards and has transformed into a mechanism for maintaining advantage. Skill will not be contained forever by paperwork. You know as you observe the craftsman's quiet rebellion against regulations that cannot regulate excellence, only delay its recognition. Talent will not bow permanently to tradition that has forgotten its own purpose, that has transformed from pathway into barrier, from support into obstacle, from encouragement into impediment. The marketplace waits beyond these regulatory walls, full of people whose homes need furniture, whose daily lives require tools, whose spirits hunger for the beauty that skilled hands create when they're free to follow inspiration rather than regulation. These potential customers do not care about guild membership or official documentation. They care about quality, durability, beauty, functionality, the simple miracle of raw material transformed into useful art through the application of skill and care. You watch as he sets down his tools, knowing tomorrow will bring the same restrictions, the same barriers between ability and opportunity, the same artificial separation between skill and its expression in useful form. But tonight, his hands have spoken in wood, and wood has answered with grace that no regulation can diminish, beauty that no bureaucracy can contain, perfection that needs no permission beyond the material's willingness to be transformed and the craftsman's knowledge of how transformation happens when talent meets, opportunity in the sacred space where creation occurs. The candles burn lower as night deepens, but the furniture he has created will outlast the officials who would prevent its creation, will serve families long after the guild masters have been forgotten, will stand as testimony to the truth that skill seeks no permission, needs no approval, requires only the freedom to express itself in forms that serve human need and honor the materials from which useful beauty is born. Grief has no budget line. You sit with her in the waiting room, where widows learn that 20 years of loyalty can disappear with the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, where service and sacrifice become entries in ledgers that balance everything except justice. The morning light filters through grimy windows onto benches, worn smooth by the shifting weight of those who wait for compassion that arrives measured in copper coins and distributed according to regulations written by men who have never watched their life's partner fade away despite all the love and prayer and desperate hope that human hearts can contain. Her husband served faithfully through 2 decades of conflicts that history will remember in marble monuments, while forgetting the families who paid their cost in sleepless nights and empty beds and conversations that ended mid-sentence when orders arrived requiring departure within the hour. You feel the weight of accumulated service settling around her like invisible armor, protection that should shield her from want, but has somehow become transparent to the bureaucratic eyes that see forms rather than faces, documentation rather than devotion. We sympathize, but policy is policy, the clerk explains, with the practiced tone of those who have learned to deliver heartbreak with professional courtesy, as if compassion were a luxury that government cannot afford, rather than the foundation upon which legitimate authority must rest. His rubber stamp waits beside the denied application like an executioner's axe, ready to fall with the mechanical precision of systems that have forgotten their human purpose. One document stands between dignity and destitution, you realize as she shuffles through papers worn soft by handling, searching for the form that would prove what everyone knows but no one will officially acknowledge: that she deserves the security her husband's service was supposed to guarantee, that 20 years of faithful duty should purchase more than sympathy, without substance, condolences without compensation. Gender and law intersect in ways that multiply disadvantage, like compound interest on unpayable debt. Widowhood becomes not just loss, but legal handicap, not just grief, but institutional punishment for the crime of surviving when survival itself has become economically impossible without the protection that regulations promise, but bureaucracy refuses to deliver. You see how the system treats her loss as her fault, her need as her weakness, her legitimate claim as unreasonable demand. Community support emerges like flowers growing through pavement cracks, neighbors becoming the safety net that government has abandoned, friendship filling gaps that policy has created through its combination of grand promises and petty enforcement. You witness how ordinary people accomplish what extraordinary institutions claim they cannot, providing security to those who deserve it, dignity to those who have earned it, care to those who have given care when their country needed it most. That administrative maze stretches before her like a labyrinth designed by those who hope that confusion will accomplish what honest denial cannot. The elimination of legitimate claims through exhaustion rather than examination, through bureaucratic endurance testing rather than actual evaluation of merit or need or simple human decency. Endless lines lead to endless denials, each rejection spawning requirements for additional documentation that spawns additional opportunities for additional rejections. She served the state. The state forgot to serve back, you think as you observe. This daily tragedy playing out in waiting rooms across the kingdom, wherever bureaucracy has learned to protect itself by abandoning those who protected it, wherever systems have grown more concerned with their own preservation than with preserving the people they were created to serve. Human dignity hangs in the balance of forms that reduce complex lives to simple checkboxes that transform decades of devotion into data points that either fit regulatory requirements or disappear into files that no one will review, until someone forces review through persistence that most people cannot afford and should not be required to demonstrate. Her worth as a human being awaits validation from validators who have never validated anything more challenging than their own paychecks. You feel the institutional indifference settling over this scene like fog over a battlefield, obscuring the human landscape with the cold precision of regulations that regulate everything except their own capacity for cruelty. The pension system has become pensionless for those who need it most, supportive only of those who administer it, protective only of its own procedures rather than the people those procedures were designed to protect. The widow's case file grows, thicker with each visit, accumulating documentation that documents nothing except the system's ability to generate requirements for more documentation. Forms multiply like cells dividing, each requiring information that requires additional forms that require additional information in an infinite regression of bureaucratic reproduction that creates everything except the support it promises to provide. 20 years of her husband's life condensed into a folder that some clerk will eventually miss filing, causing additional delays in processing that has already delayed too long, creating additional barriers to support that should flow as naturally as rivers flow toward the sea. You observe how service becomes statistic, sacrifice becomes paperwork, devotion becomes problem for someone else to solve during regular business hours that never seem to include the hours when help is actually needed. The moral mathematics of this situation calculates incorrectly. 2 decades of service should equal security. Faithful duty should equal faithful support. Protecting the kingdom should guarantee protection from the kingdom when protection is needed most. But bureaucratic arithmetic operates according to different formulas, equations that balance budgets rather than lives, that solve for institutional convenience rather than individual need. Evening approaches as she gathers her papers, preparing to return tomorrow to the same desks, the same clerks, the same explanations of why her obvious need cannot be met by the obvious resources that her husband's obvious service should have obviously secured. The cycle will repeat until persistence overcomes resistance or exhaustion overcomes persistence, until the system yields to justice or justice yields to the system's superior capacity for outlasting those who seek it. Kindness needs no paperwork. You realize as you watch her leave, dignity requires no documentation. Hearts keep their own accounts that balance love given with love deserved, service rendered with service returned. The widow carries within herself all the authorization she needs for the support she seeks. But the system that should recognize this authorization has forgotten how to read the language of merit, the script of sacrifice, the currency of devotion that should be legal tender in any nation worth the loyalty it demands from those who defend it. Hearts keep their own accounts, you understand, as darkness settles over the administrative building where her case awaits. Tomorrow's consideration, where bureaucracy sleeps peacefully while those it serves lie awake, calculating costs they cannot afford, and dreaming of security that regulations promise but procedures refuse to provide. Knowledge hoards itself behind golden gates. You observe the bright child standing at the threshold of possibility, her eyes reflecting intelligence that burns like starlight in the darkness of circumstances that would extinguish lesser flames. Her mind moves with the quick precision of natural curiosity meeting infinite questions. But her path forward narrows with each passing day as the mathematics of exclusion calculate her future with ruthless accuracy. Intelligence, you realize, means nothing when limited by birth circumstances, when brilliance must purchase permission to shine from those who have never illuminated anything brighter than their own comfort. School fees rise like walls built to keep knowledge within reach of only those whose reach extends to purses heavy enough to satisfy institutional hunger for payment. The bright child's family counts copper coins while education costs silver, measures necessity against impossibility, weighs dreams against the daily arithmetic of survival that leaves no remainder for learning beyond what grandfathers can teach, and mothers can remember from their own truncated encounters with formal wisdom. Smart enough for school, too poor for wisdom, becomes the cruel equation that defines her days. the mathematical reality that intelligence cannot solve, because the problem lies not in understanding, but in access, not in ability, but in opportunity, not in merit, but in money that her family does not possess and cannot acquire quickly enough to purchase the education that her mind deserves and society needs her to receive. The teacher's dilemma plays out in classroom decisions that break hearts, while maintaining policies, individual compassion constrained by institutional regulations that forbid the generosity that teaching spirits naturally want to express. She watches brilliant students leave empty-handed, while lesser minds purchase seats through family connections or accumulated wealth, witnessing daily the tragedy of wasted potential dressed in administrative necessity. You feel the teacher's internal conflict. Her desire to teach battling her obligation to enforce rules that make teaching conditional rather than universal, that transform education from human right into commercial privilege. She sees genius walking away because genius cannot afford admission, watches society impoverish itself by excluding those who would enrich it if given the chance that circumstances deny and regulations refuse to provide. Societal loss accumulates, like compound interest on unpaid moral debts, wasted potential taking human form in children whose questions die unanswered, whose curiosity atrophies from lack of nourishment, whose gifts to future generations remain undelivered because the present generation cannot afford to deliver them. The kingdom grows poorer. With each brilliant mind, it cannot afford to educate. Weaker with each potential leader it cannot support. Dimmer with each light it allows to flicker out for lack of fuel that schools hoard behind payment requirements. Class. Barriers construct themselves from the building blocks of educational policy. Each regulation another stone in walls that separate capability from opportunity, talent from development, promise from fulfillment. The bright child learns her first lesson in social architecture. How systems designed to advance human knowledge simultaneously prevent human advancement. How institutions created to expand minds contract opportunity. How education preserves ignorance by restricting access to its opposite. Alternative learning emerges like wildflowers growing between cobblestones. Grandfather's stories competing with formal education for the privilege of shaping young minds hungry for understanding. Regardless of its source, ancient wisdom passes from generation to generation without requiring fees or documentation, carrying truths that accumulated wealth cannot purchase, and institutional authority cannot control or contaminate with bureaucratic priorities. You witness these informal academies flourishing in kitchens where recipes teach chemistry, in workshops where repairs teach physics, in gardens where planting teaches biology, in homes where love teaches the most important lessons of all. That knowledge serves life rather than the reverse. That wisdom flows freely when not artificially constrained. That learning happens naturally when curiosity meets caring guidance rather than administrative obstacles. Future implications stretch before the bright child, like roads that lead everywhere she cannot go, possibilities that multiply in her imagination while diminishing in her reality. Potential careers that require educational credentials she cannot afford to obtain, despite possessing the intelligence necessary to excel in any field that would welcome her contributions. Her unschooled brilliance will find expression somehow, but society will lose the benefit of her trained capabilities, the gifts that education could have refined and focused toward collective benefit. The long-term cost of excluding intelligence reveals itself in generations of problems that excluded minds might have solved, innovations that uninvested talent never develops, solutions that untrained brilliance never formulates to challenges that continue plaguing communities because the people capable of addressing them were prevented from developing their capabilities. by systems more concerned with payment than potential. Competition emerges between formal and informal education, between institutional learning that requires fees and family wisdom that costs nothing except time and attention. That loving elders gladly provide to children whose questions deserve answers regardless of their ability to pay for official responses. The bright child learns to value knowledge itself rather than its sources, understanding over credentials, wisdom over documentation. Grandfather's teaching carries different authority than classroom instruction, rooted in experience rather than theory, proven through living rather than testing, validated by results rather than regulations. His lessons cost nothing except the attention that love naturally provides, flowing freely from generation to generation, like rivers that recognize no barriers except those artificially constructed by those who would bottle water and sell access to what should remain commonly available. Hope emerges in the recognition that wisdom travels light, requiring no heavy purse or official documentation for passage through generations that understand its value and provide its transmission through channels deeper than institutional policy. No fee can stop a curious mind from finding knowledge that wants to be found, answers that seek questioners as eagerly as questioners seek answers. The bright child's intelligence cannot be contained by financial limitations any more than starlight can be contained by clouds that temporarily obscure but cannot permanently extinguish celestial illumination. Her mind will find ways to grow that regulations cannot prevent, will discover sources of learning that fees cannot restrict, will develop capabilities that exclusion cannot ultimately suppress. You understand as evening settles over this scene, that knowledge hoards itself behind golden gates only temporarily, that wisdom eventually finds ways to flow toward minds capable of receiving and using it, that barriers created by human policy cannot permanently prevent what human nature demands, the continuation of learning that links generation to generation, the passage of understanding that serves life rather than serving those who would control access to what belongs naturally to all who hunger for wisdom and possess the intelligence to digest what education provides when it remembers its purpose. Justice wears blindfolds, but bureaucracy has perfect vision. You stand at the threshold of ultimate irony, where the final complaint addresses the very system designed to address complaints, where the last grievance concerns the mechanism created to resolve grievances, where justice itself stands accused by those who sought justice and found instead an elaborate maze constructed to exhaust seekers rather than satisfy seeking. The meta-problem reveals itself with crystalline clarity. The system that creates all other problems has become the greatest problem of all. The courthouse steps stretch upward like a mountain built from marble and disappointment, each level representing another layer of appeal that must be purchased rather than earned, another court that must be convinced rather than informed, another fee that must be paid by those who have already paid the ultimate price of believing that justice could be bought with anything as common as truth, or as abundant as evidence, or as simple as being right. Layers of appeal stack themselves, like geological formations laid down over centuries of accumulated grievance, each stratum representing another generation's attempt to find fairness within systems designed to find reasons why fairness cannot be afforded, cannot be delivered, cannot be provided to those who need it most when they need it most desperately. Court after court rises above the original dispute like monuments to the human capacity for complicating solutions that should be simple, for making expensive what should be freely available. The citizen's exhaustion settles over the scene like evening fog, the bone-deep weariness of those who have learned that fighting the system becomes the punishment for being wronged by the system, that seeking justice through official channels requires more resources than most injustices steal, more time than most lives can spare, more hope than most hearts can generate, when constantly disappointed by institutions that promise relief while providing additional suffering. You feel this exhaustion accumulating in waiting rooms, filled with those who have discovered that being right costs more than being wrong, that proving innocence requires more effort than committing guilt, that obtaining justice demands more sacrifice than accepting injustice. Fighting the system becomes the punishment you realize, as the cure reveals itself more painful than the disease, the solution more costly than the problem it purports to solve. Procedural labyrinths wind through legal landscapes designed by those who profit from confusion, who benefit from complexity, who thrive on the very obstacles that prevent ordinary citizens from accessing the justice that extraordinary institutions promise to provide. How complexity serves power becomes clear as you observe these architectural marvels of administrative obstruction, these carefully constructed barriers that protect systems from those they supposedly serve. Each corridor leads to another corridor. Each office refers to another office. Each form requires additional forms that reference other forms in infinite regression of bureaucratic reproduction that creates everything except resolution. The maze protects its own existence by making navigation so difficult that most travelers abandon their journey before reaching destinations that may not exist except as theoretical possibilities, discussed in training manuals that clerks never read. The cost of justice reveals itself in calculations more complex than any grievance that brought citizens to seek justice in the first place. Right becomes expensive while wrong remains free. Truth requires payment while lies cost nothing. Justice demands tribute while injustice flows as freely as water, finding its natural level in systems that have learned to flow away from rather than toward those who need them most. You observe how the economics of seeking redress creates additional problems that dwarf the original grievances, how the cure costs more than the disease, how the solution impoverishes those it claims to serve, while enriching those who administer solutions that solve nothing except their own financial needs. Justice becomes commodity traded by those who never needed to purchase it, sold to those who cannot afford its price. Systemic indifference reveals itself as more than mere bureaucratic inefficiency, more than simple administrative oversight, more than accidental institutional blindness to human need. The system has learned to protect itself by wearing down those who would change it, by making reform more exhausting than acceptance, by ensuring that revolution requires more energy than resignation, that hope costs more than despair. When institutions protect themselves rather than those they supposedly serve, you realize they cease being institutions and become obstacles, cease providing solutions and become problems, cease serving justice and become impediments to justice that require their own separate category of grievance that no existing system seems capable of addressing, because the system cannot investigate itself without conflict of interest that guarantees predetermined results. The ultimate irony crystallizes with perfect clarity. Seeking justice from the unjust becomes its own form of injustice. Asking fair treatment from unfair systems becomes another form of unfairness. Demanding accountability from unaccountable institutions becomes another form of unaccountability that multiplies the original problem while claiming to solve it. Citizens find themselves prosecuting their own cases against systems that make prosecution impossible, defending their own rights against institutions that make defense unaffordable, seeking remedy from mechanisms that have learned to perpetuate the problems they were created to remedy. The snake devours its own tail while claiming to provide nourishment. The system consumes its own purpose while claiming to fulfill its function. You witness the tragedy of good intentions institutionalized into bad results, noble purposes bureaucratized into ignoble procedures, justice systematized into injustice through the simple process of making justice conditional rather than universal, purchasable rather than inherent, procedural rather than natural, complex rather than simple, expensive rather than free, distant rather than immediate, theoretical rather than practical. The final grievance writes itself in the accumulated disappointment of all who sought justice, and found instead elaborate explanations of why justice cannot be provided, why remedies cannot be delivered, why solutions cannot be implemented, why systems designed to serve have learned to be served, why institutions created to help have learned to help themselves, to the resources of those who need help most. Truth prepares to meet power as the last torch flickers in the courthouse corridor, as the throne room waits beyond these preliminary chambers of disappointment, as the final audience approaches, where ultimate authority will face ultimate responsibility, where the king must answer for what his kingdom has become, where power must justify itself to those it has failed to serve despite collecting taxes, sufficient to serve everyone if service, rather than self-service, were the institutional priority. The dramatic transition approaches like dawn after the longest night, promising either the sunrise of justice or the continued darkness of systems that have forgotten why they exist, who they serve, how they should function when functioning properly, rather than protecting themselves from those who need them to function properly. The throne room stretched before him like a marble cathedral, built to worship power rather than divinity, its vast dimensions calculated to diminish visitors, while amplifying authority, to make supplicants feel small, while making rulers feel infinite. He stood at the chamber's heart, his voice carrying the weight of 14 grievances across stone that had absorbed centuries of similar complaints, walls that had witnessed endless processions of the wronged seeking remedy from those whose primary concern was maintaining the systems that created wrong in the first place. The king sat motionless upon his throne, as if carved from the same stone that surrounded them, his stillness so complete it seemed less like patience and more like geological patience, the sort of waiting that mountains do while civilizations rise and fall in their shadows. His silence filled the enormous space more completely than any proclamation could have managed, creating weight that settled over the scene like winter snow accumulating depth through sheer persistence rather than dramatic accumulation. Marble. Witnesses lined the walls in the form of previous rulers whose stone eyes gazed blindly at scenes they could no longer influence, their carved faces wearing expressions that suggested they too had once listened to grievances remarkably similar to those being voiced today. These stone monarchs had heard similar complaints about taxation and bureaucracy, about systems that served themselves rather than those they governed, about the eternal tension between authorities' convenience and subjects' needs. Golden silence dominated the throne room more effectively than any golden speech could have managed, creating space where words could settle and find their proper weight, rather than being immediately deflected by royal responses that might prevent deeper understanding. The king's stillness became active, listening made visible, attention given physical form through the simple act of refusing to interrupt, to explain, to defend, to justify what had been done in his name by systems operating under his authority. Incense drifted through air thick with the accumulated weight of unresolved grievances. Perfumed smoke that cannot mask the fundamental odor of injustice that permeated institutional spaces, where power concentrated while responsibility diffused. The sweet smoke rose toward vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of justice triumphant, artistic fantasies that decorated the reality of justice deferred, delayed, denied through procedural complexity that served everyone except those who needed serving. The citizen's voice carried across marble expanses that had been designed to make individual concerns sound small and institutional responses sound grand. But tonight, the proportions seemed reversed. His words gained strength from the stone surfaces that reflected them back, amplified, multiplied, given resonance that bureaucratic offices had never provided. How small truths sound in vast spaces became less important than how vast spaces could amplify small truths until they filled chambers built to contain them. Court dynamics played out in glances exchanged between advisors who calculated political implications while their king calculated moral ones, between ministers who weighed procedural precedents while their monarch weighed human precedents, between officials who measured institutional convenience while their ruler measured the cost of convenience to those who paid for it through suffering that convenience was meant to prevent. The advisors watched and whispered among themselves, their quiet conferences creating counterpoint to the citizens' steady recitation of systematic failures. They whispered about budget implications and procedural precedents, about legal complications and administrative difficulties, about all the reasons why obvious solutions to obvious problems remained obviously impossible according to obviously self-serving logic that served everything except justice. Power relationships revealed themselves through posture and positioning, through who stood and who sat, who spoke and who listened, who carried grievances and who carried authority to address grievances, or authority to ignore them, or authority to create additional procedures that would delay addressing them until those who carried them grew too exhausted to carry them any further. Authority observed authenticity across the formal distance that separated throne from floor, crown from common concern, institutional perspective from individual experience. The king saw in this citizen's presentation not just 14 specific grievances, but the systemic pattern they represented. Not just particular failures, but general failure of systems to remember their purpose, their obligation, their reason for existing in the first place. The weight of crowns became palpable in the throne room's atmosphere, not just the physical weight of gold and jewels that marked royal authority, but the moral weight of responsibility for everything done by systems operating under royal authorization, everything left undone by institutions claiming royal protection, from criticism, royal immunity, from accountability. Building tension filled the space between complaint and response, like storm pressure, building between earth and sky, the electrical potential that accumulates when opposing forces approach critical proximity. The citizen had presented his case with the thoroughness of preparation and the passion of experience, laying out pattern after pattern of systematic failure that demanded systematic response. Atmospheric detail accumulated like evidence in a case being built by the room itself. Torch flames that flickered with each breath of air moved by human emotion. Shadows that shifted as bodies adjusted to accommodate the weight of what they were hearing. Stone that seemed to lean forward as if the building itself were listening with the same intensity as its occupants. The space between complaint and response stretched like a bridge under construction, each moment of silence adding another span. Across the chasm that separated power from responsibility, authority from accountability, the crown from the consequences of policies implemented in its name by systems that claim to serve it while serving primarily themselves. Cinematic pacing emerged from the natural rhythm of important moments that refuse to be rushed, that demand the full weight of consideration that their importance deserves. Time moved differently in throne rooms, where decisions shaped the lives of millions, where single words could redirect the flow of justice like boulders redirecting rivers, where royal consideration carried consequences that extended far beyond the marble walls that contained it. Words echoed through chambers designed for echo, their reverberations creating layers of meaning that built upon each other like musical harmonies. The citizen's voice mixed with its own reflections from stone surfaces, creating chorus of grievance that filled every corner of royal space, with the accumulated weight of systematic failure demanding systematic remedy. Hearts waited throughout the kingdom, you realized, in villages where widows counted coppers and merchants calculated impossible taxes, in workshops where craftsmen carved beauty they could not legally sell, in homes where bright children asked questions that education would not answer because education could not be afforded. The entire realm held its breath while justice prepared to announce whether it remembered its own name. Time held its breath in the throne room where centuries of similar scenes had played out, where power had met responsibility in formal encounters that determined whether authority would serve justice or continue requiring justice to serve authority, whether systems would remember their purpose or continue forgetting why they existed while meticulously remembering how to perpetuate their existence. The throne room became theatre where the oldest drama in human governance prepared for its next scene, the moment when power must choose between convenience and conscience, between serving itself and serving those who provide the foundation upon which all power ultimately rests, between maintaining systems that maintain themselves and reforming systems that serve the human purposes for which they were originally created. The silence stretched through the throne room like a held breath, but within that external stillness, the king's mind moved with the restless energy of a ruler who had just witnessed the full scope of his kingdom's failures laid bare before him. 14 grievances echoed in his thoughts, each one a thread in a tapestry of systematic dysfunction that he was only now beginning to see in its complete and devastating pattern. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than in this moment of understanding, when the true cost of ruling through systems rather than wisdom revealed itself with crystalline clarity. His internal monologue began with the mathematics of responsibility that every true ruler must eventually confront. 14 grievances, he calculated, but 40 million subjects living under the same systems that had created these particular injustices. If one citizen could accumulate 14 separate encounters with bureaucratic failure, how many millions of similar stories remained unheard, unwitnessed, unaddressed throughout his realm? The multiplication was staggering, the implications overwhelming, the moral arithmetic undeniable. Each grievance represented not just individual suffering, but systemic dysfunction that touched countless lives in ways he had never been forced to contemplate. The dowry seized on a wedding morning spoke to thousands of similar confiscations, thousands of families whose most precious moments had been invaded by bureaucratic necessity that served no one except the bureaucrats who implemented it. The water rights dispute reflected hundreds of communities where ancient agreements had been superseded by modern complications that created conflict where none had existed before. Royal responsibility revealed itself as more than ceremonial obligation, more than theoretical accountability, more than the abstract burden that philosophers discussed in treatises he had read, but never truly understood until this moment of practical application. He felt the full weight of every policy implemented in his name, every regulation enforced under his authority, every systematic failure that had occurred while he occupied this throne and claimed the right to rule over lives he had never bothered to examine closely enough to rule wisely. The historical perspective began to emerge as he considered how this moment connected to the eternal challenge of governance, how every ruler throughout history had faced similar moments of revelation, when the gap between intention and implementation, between policy and practice, between royal will and bureaucratic reality, became impossible to ignore or explain away through comfortable abstractions about the necessity of systematic administration. His predecessors, whose stone faces gazed down from the walls around him, had undoubtedly faced similar presentations of systematic failure. Some had responded with reform that briefly improved conditions before bureaucracy learned to work around reform, creating new complications to replace the old ones. Others had responded with explanation, with justification, with elaborate defenses, of systems that served power more effectively than they served people. A few had responded with resignation, abandoning the effort to govern justly in favor of governing efficiently, choosing institutional convenience over individual justice. The personal dimension of ruling began to separate itself from the political dimension as he contemplated the human being behind the crown, the individual conscience that existed independently of royal authority, the moral sensibility that predated his coronation and would survive his eventual departure from this throne. What did he owe to his own understanding of right and wrong, apart from what he owed to precedent, tradition, institutional stability, bureaucratic convenience? The king found himself examining the machine he commanded from a perspective he had never previously adopted, seeing it not as the extension of royal will that he had always assumed it to be, but as an independent organism that had learned to serve its own survival and growth more effectively than it served the purposes for which it had been created. The bureaucracy had developed its own logic, its own priorities, its own methods of perpetuating itself, while claiming to serve him and through him, the people whose lives it actually governed more directly than he ever could. Systemic understanding dawned like sunrise over a landscape he had always seen in twilight, revealing features that had been invisible in the comfortable darkness of assumed competence and inherited procedure. He saw how each department protected itself through complexity that made oversight impossible, how each level of administration created justifications for additional levels of administration, how the very systems designed to solve problems had become expert at creating new problems that required expanded systems to address. The moral calculation he faced was unlike any decision he had made during his reign, more fundamental than questions of war and peace, more profound than matters of taxation and expenditure, more consequential than diplomatic negotiations or dynastic succession. This was the essential question that defined legitimate rule. Would he serve the systems that claimed to serve him? Or would he remember that both he and his systems existed to serve something larger than either of them individually? Justice versus precedent presented itself as the central tension of his deliberation. Precedent argued for gradual reform, for working within existing systems, for respecting the accumulated wisdom of institutional experience that had created current procedures through centuries of trial and error. Justice argued for immediate action, for cutting through bureaucratic complexity with royal authority, for remembering that systems served people rather than the reverse. Practicality competed with idealism in his internal debate. Administrative realism wrestling with moral imperatives that seemed to demand changes that might destabilize the very mechanisms through which change would have to be implemented. How could he reform systems using the same systems that had created the problems, requiring reform? How could bureaucracy fix what bureaucracy had broken without breaking itself in the process? The wisdom of pause revealed itself as he felt the pressure of the moment demanding immediate response, immediate solutions, immediate transformation of systematic problems that had developed over decades of accumulated dysfunction. Great decisions required great silence, he understood, not because delay served justice, but because justice deserved consideration worthy of its importance, reflection proportional to its consequences, deliberation careful enough to avoid creating new problems. While solving old ones, philosophical depth emerged from the practical considerations that surrounded him, the recognition that power's loneliest moment was indeed the decision, the instant when authority must choose between competing obligations, conflicting loyalties, different versions of service that led in opposite directions. The crown weighed heavier as the choice crystallized, not because the decision was difficult to make, but because making it well required understanding its full implications for everyone who would live with its consequences. The transformation of his understanding completed itself as he realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day he accepted the crown, that every ruler eventually faced the choice between serving systems or serving justice, between maintaining comfortable dysfunction or accepting the disruption that real reform always required. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. He could preserve the machinery of government that had brought him these grievances, or he could remember why government existed in the first place. The king's voice, when it finally broke the marble, silence, carried the weight of decision made not in haste, but in the fullness of understanding that comes only after genuine consideration of alternatives and their consequences. His words emerged measured and deliberate, each syllable shaped by the recognition that royal decrees carried the power to redirect the flow of justice throughout his realm, to transform the daily lives of millions who would never know his name, but would live with the results of what he decided in this moment of crystallized authority. "Enough," he said, and the single word resonated through the throne room with the finality of judgment, rendered after patient deliberation, of patience exhausted not by impatience, but by complete understanding of what patience with injustice actually cost those who could not afford to be patient with their own suffering, while bureaucracy took its time deciding whether their suffering deserved attention. The royal decree that followed emerged not as proclamation driven by emotion, but as systematic response to systematic failure, each element of reform carefully calibrated to address specific dysfunctions that had been revealed through the citizens' methodical presentation of grievance after grievance. The king's solutions demonstrated that he had listened not just to individual complaints, but to the pattern they revealed, not just to particular problems, but to the general problem of systems that had forgotten their purpose. Bureaucratic reform began with the recognition that complexity served those who administered complexity, rather than those who needed services that complexity was supposed to deliver. The machinery of justice would be oiled with attention rather than lubricated with procedure, simplified rather than elaborated, focused on results rather than process, measured by satisfaction rather than compliance with regulations that regulated everything except their own effectiveness. Tax collection would be reformed to recognize that marriage was celebration rather than opportunity for confiscation, that wedding days deserve protection from bureaucratic intrusion, that the state's need for revenue could be balanced with citizens' need for dignity during their most precious moments. The dowry seizure that had begun this evening's catalogue of grievances would be the last such seizure in his kingdom, the final time that joy would be interrupted by bureaucratic necessity. Water rights would return to community management rather than bureaucratic adjudication, recognizing that neighbors understood their needs better than distant officials understood regulations, that local solutions worked better than centralized complexity, that thirst was indeed democracy's cruelest joke when democracy created systems that made water conditional, rather than treating it as the necessity it had always been. Guild monopolies would yield to merit-based licensing that measured skill rather than connection, competence rather than compliance, quality rather than fee-paying ability. The young craftsman, whose hands spoke wisdom while his papers remained silent, would receive recognition for what he could create rather than punishment for what he could not afford to document. The citizens' response revealed itself in the straightening of shoulders that had carried the weight of systematic disappointment, in the lifting of eyes that had grown accustomed to studying flaws rather than meeting the gaze of authority, in the quiet dignity of validation that comes when power acknowledges wrong and commits to making it right. Hope rekindled itself like flame, finding fresh fuel after burning low in the darkness of bureaucratic indifference. immediate implementation distinguished this royal decree from previous reforms that had been announced with great ceremony and implemented with great delay, creating time for bureaucratic resistance to organize, for systematic inertia to reassert itself, for change to be changed back into something resembling what it had supposedly changed. By tomorrow's dawn, these wrongs would right themselves, the king declared, understanding that justice delayed was justice denied, that reform postponed was reform prevented. The systematic nature of change reflected the systematic nature of the problems being addressed, each reform connecting to others in ways that would prevent bureaucratic workarounds, administrative end runs, procedural circumventions that had historically allowed systems to adapt to reform without actually reforming. The king had learned that changing one element of a system without changing related elements simply shifted problems rather than solving them. Royal authority asserted itself not through force, but through clarity, not through threat, but through commitment, not through punishment, but through the promise of reward for those who serve justice, rather than serving themselves. The decree carried the weight of genuine power exercised on behalf of those who had no power, authority used to protect rather than to dominate, governance employed to serve rather than to be served. The citizens' quiet exit from the throne room marked the completion of a transaction that had nothing to do with commerce and everything to do with the fundamental relationship between ruler and ruled, between authority and accountability, between power and the purposes for which power existed. Grace in victory meant accepting vindication without vindictiveness. Dignity in validation meant carrying justice without carrying grudges against those who had denied it. Bureaucratic transformation began immediately as word of the royal decree spread through administrative corridors like water finding its natural level, like truth finding its natural audience, like reform finding its natural resistance among those who had profited from the dysfunction being reformed. Some officials adapted quickly to the new reality, embracing change that aligned with their original reasons for entering public service. Others adapted slowly, requiring supervision and encouragement to remember that they served the public rather than serving themselves. The symbolic closure of this evening's events painted itself across the western sky as sunset settled over the palace, its light streaming through windows that had witnessed the transformation of systematic failure into systematic reform, the conversion of bureaucratic indifference into royal attention, the evolution of governance from self-service to public service. Dawn over the kingdom would bring practical changes that touched daily lives in ways that royal ceremonies rarely managed to accomplish. Improvements that citizens would notice not because they were announced with fanfare, but because they made ordinary transactions less burdensome, common interactions less frustrating, routine encounters with authority less punitive and more helpful. The poetic justice of this resolution lay not in punishment for those who had created problems, but in solutions that prevented future problems, not in retribution against systematic failure, but in transformation of systems that had failed into systems designed to succeed at serving the purposes for which they existed. Justice had been served not through vengeance, but through the simple act of making things work the way they should have worked all along. Reform rippled outward from the throne room like circles expanding from stones dropped in still water, reaching every corner of the kingdom, where citizens had learned to expect disappointment from their government and would now discover the pleasant surprise of systems that actually functioned, officials who actually helped, bureaucracy that actually served, rather than extracting service from those it was supposed to serve. Sometimes the system remembers its purpose, the king reflected as evening deepened into night, as the palace settled into the quiet satisfaction of authority exercised wisely, of power used well, of governance that had rediscovered the difference between ruling and serving, between commanding and helping, between demanding loyalty and earning the respect that made loyalty voluntary rather than compelled. The silence stretched through the throne room like a held breath, but within that external stillness, the king's mind moved with the restless energy of a ruler who had just witnessed the full scope of his kingdom's failures laid bare before him. 14 grievances echoed in his thoughts, each one a thread, in a tapestry of systematic dysfunction that he was only now beginning to see in its complete and devastating pattern. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than in this moment of understanding, when the true cost of ruling through systems, rather than wisdom, revealed itself with crystalline clarity. His internal monologue began with the mathematics of responsibility that every true ruler must eventually confront. 14 grievances, he calculated, but 40 million subjects living under the same systems that had created these particular injustices. If one citizen could accumulate 14 separate encounters with bureaucratic failure, how many millions of similar stories remained unheard, unwitnessed, unaddressed throughout his realm? The multiplication was staggering, the implications overwhelming, the moral arithmetic undeniable. Each grievance represented not just individual suffering, but systemic dysfunction that touched countless lives in ways he had never been forced to contemplate. The dowry seized on a wedding morning spoke to thousands of similar confiscations. Thousands of families whose most precious moments had been invaded by bureaucratic necessity that served no one except the bureaucrats who implemented it. The water rights dispute reflected hundreds of communities where ancient agreements had been superseded by modern complications that created conflict where none had existed before. Royal responsibility revealed itself as more than ceremonial obligation, more than theoretical accountability, more than the abstract burden that philosophers discussed in treatises he had read but never truly understood until this moment of practical application. He felt the full weight of every policy implemented in his name, every regulation enforced under his authority, every systematic failure that had occurred while he occupied this throne and claimed the right to rule over lives he had never bothered to examine closely enough to rule wisely. The historical perspective began to emerge as he considered how this moment connected to the eternal challenge of governance, how every ruler throughout history had faced similar moments of revelation when the gap between intention and implementation, between policy and practice, between royal will and bureaucratic reality, became impossible to ignore or explain away. Through comfortable abstractions about the necessity of systematic administration. His predecessors, whose stone faces gazed down from the walls around him, had undoubtedly faced similar presentations of systematic failure. Some had responded with reform that briefly improved conditions before bureaucracy learned to work around reform, creating new complications to replace the old ones. Others had responded with explanation, with justification, with elaborate defenses of systems that served power more effectively than they served people. A few had responded with resignation, abandoning the effort to govern justly in favor of governing efficiently, choosing institutional convenience over individual justice. The personal dimension of ruling began to separate itself from the political dimension as he contemplated the human being behind the crown, the individual conscience that existed independently of royal authority, the moral sensibility that predated his coronation and would survive his eventual departure from this throne. What did he owe to his own understanding of right and wrong, apart from what he owed to precedent, tradition, institutional stability, bureaucratic convenience? The king found himself examining the machine he commanded from a perspective he had never previously adopted, seeing it not as the extension of royal will that he had always assumed it to be, but as an independent organism that had learned to serve its own survival and growth more effectively than it served the purposes for which it had been created. The bureaucracy had developed its own logic, its own priorities, its own methods of perpetuating itself. while claiming to serve him and through him, the people whose lives it actually governed more directly than he ever could. Systemic understanding dawned like sunrise over a landscape he had always seen in twilight, revealing features that had been invisible in the comfortable darkness of assumed competence and inherited procedure. He saw how each department protected itself through complexity that made oversight impossible, how each level of administration created justifications for additional levels of administration, how the very systems designed to solve problems had become expert at creating new problems that required expanded systems to address. The moral calculation he faced was unlike any decision he had made during his reign, more fundamental than questions of war and peace, more profound than matters of taxation and expenditure, more consequential than diplomatic negotiations or dynastic succession. This was the essential question that defined legitimate rule. Would he serve the systems that claimed to serve him, or would he remember that both he and his systems existed to serve something larger than either of them individually? Justice versus precedent presented itself as the central tension of his deliberation. Precedent argued for gradual reform, for working within existing systems, for respecting the accumulated wisdom of institutional experience that had created current procedures. Through centuries of trial and error, justice argued for immediate action, for cutting through bureaucratic complexity with royal authority, for remembering that systems serve people rather than the reverse. Practicality competed with idealism in his internal debate. Administrative realism wrestling with moral imperatives that seemed to demand changes that might destabilize the very mechanisms through which change would have to be implemented. How could he reform systems using the same systems that had created the problems requiring reform? How could bureaucracy fix what bureaucracy had broken without breaking itself in the process? The wisdom of pause revealed itself as he felt the pressure of the moment demanding immediate response, immediate solutions, immediate transformation of systematic problems that had developed over decades of accumulated dysfunction. Great decisions required great silence, he understood, not because delay served justice, but because justice deserved consideration worthy of its importance, reflection proportional to its consequences, deliberation careful enough to avoid creating new problems while solving old ones. Philosophical depth emerged from the practical considerations that surrounded him. The recognition that power's loneliest moment was indeed the decision, the instant when authority must choose between competing obligations, conflicting loyalties, different versions of service that led in opposite directions. The crown weighed, heavier as the choice crystallized, not because the decision was difficult to make, but because making it well required understanding its full implications for everyone who would live with its consequences. The transformation of his understanding completed itself as he realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day he accepted the crown, that every ruler eventually faced the choice between serving systems or serving justice, between maintaining comfortable dysfunction or accepting the disruption that real reform always required. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. He could preserve the machinery of government that had brought him these grievances, or he could remember why government existed in the first place. The king's voice, when it finally broke the marble, silence, carried the weight of decision made not in haste, but in the fullness of understanding that comes only after genuine consideration of alternatives and their consequences. His words emerged measured and deliberate, each syllable shaped by the recognition that royal decrees carried the power to redirect the flow of justice throughout his realm, to transform the daily lives of millions who would never know his name, but would live with the results of what he decided in this moment of crystallized authority. Enough, he said, and the single word resonated through the throne room, with the finality of judgment rendered after patient deliberation, of patience exhausted not by impatience, but by complete understanding of what patience with injustice, actually cost those who could not afford to be patient with their own suffering, while bureaucracy took its time deciding whether their suffering deserved attention. The royal decree that followed emerged not as proclamation driven by emotion, but as systematic response to systematic failure. Each element of reform carefully calibrated to address specific dysfunctions that had been revealed through the citizens' methodical presentation of grievance after grievance. The king's solutions demonstrated that he had listened not just to individual complaints, but to the pattern they revealed, not just to particular problems, but to the general problem of systems that had forgotten their purpose. Bureaucratic reform began with the recognition that complexity served those who administered complexity, rather than those who needed services that complexity was supposed to deliver. The machinery of justice would be oiled with attention rather than lubricated with procedure, simplified rather than elaborated, focused on results rather than process, measured by satisfaction rather than compliance with regulations that regulated everything except their own effectiveness. Tax collection would be reformed to recognize that marriage was celebration rather than opportunity for confiscation, that wedding days deserved protection from bureaucratic intrusion, that the state's need for revenue could be balanced with citizens' need for dignity during their most precious moments. The dowry seizure that had begun this evening's catalogue of grievances would be the last such seizure in his kingdom, the final time that joy would be interrupted by bureaucratic necessity. Water rights would return to community management rather than bureaucratic adjudication, recognizing that neighbors understood their needs better than distant officials understood regulations, that local solutions worked better than centralized complexity, that thirst was indeed democracy's cruelest joke when democracy created systems that made water conditional rather than treating it as the necessity it had always been. Guild monopolies would yield to merit-based licensing that measured skill rather than connection, competence rather than compliance, quality rather than fee-paying ability. The young craftsman whose hands spoke wisdom while his papers remained silent would receive recognition for what he could create rather than punishment for what he could not afford to document. The citizens' response revealed itself in the straightening of shoulders that had carried the weight of systematic disappointment, in the lifting of eyes that had grown accustomed to studying flaws rather than meeting the gaze of authority, in the quiet dignity of validation that comes when power acknowledges wrong and commits to making it right. Hope rekindled itself like flame finding fresh fuel after burning low in the darkness of bureaucratic indifference. Immediate implementation distinguished this royal decree from previous reforms that had been announced with great ceremony and implemented with great delay, creating time for bureaucratic resistance to organize, for systematic inertia to reassert itself, for change to be changed back into something resembling what it had supposedly changed. By tomorrow's dawn, these wrongs would right themselves, the king declared, understanding that justice delayed was justice denied, that reform postponed was reform prevented. The systematic nature of change reflected the systematic nature of the problems being addressed, each reform connecting to others in ways that would prevent bureaucratic workarounds, administrative end runs, procedural circumventions that had historically allowed systems to adapt to reform without actually reforming. The king had learned that changing one element of a system without changing related elements simply shifted problems rather than solving them. Royal authority asserted itself not through force, but through clarity, not through threat, but through commitment, not through punishment, but through the promise of reward for those who served justice rather than serving themselves. The decree carried the weight of genuine power exercised on behalf of those who had no power, authority used to protect rather than to dominate, governance employed to serve rather than to be served. The citizens' quiet exit from the throne room marked the completion of a transaction that had nothing to do with commerce and everything to do with the fundamental relationship between ruler and ruled, between authority and accountability, between power and the purposes for which power existed. Grace in victory meant accepting vindication without vindictiveness. Dignity in validation meant carrying justice without carrying grudges against those who had denied it. Bureaucratic transformation began immediately as word of the royal decree, spread through administrative corridors like water finding its natural level, like truth finding its natural audience, like reform finding its natural resistance among those who had profited from the dysfunction being reformed. Some officials adapted quickly to the new reality, embracing change that aligned with their original reasons for entering public service. Others adapted slowly, requiring supervision and encouragement to remember that they serve the public rather than serving themselves. The symbolic closure of this evening's events painted itself across the western sky as sunset settled over the palace, its light streaming through windows that had witnessed the transformation of systematic failure into systematic reform, the conversion of bureaucratic indifference into royal attention, the evolution of governance from self-service to public service. Dawn over the kingdom would bring practical changes that touched daily lives in ways that royal ceremonies rarely managed to accomplish. Improvements that citizens would notice not because they were announced with fanfare, but because they made ordinary transactions less burdensome, common interactions less frustrating, routine encounters with authority less punitive and more helpful. The poetic justice of this resolution lay not in punishment for those who had created problems, but in solutions that prevented future problems, not in retribution against systematic failure, but in transformation of systems that had failed into systems designed to succeed at serving the purposes for which they existed. Justice had been served not through vengeance, but through the simple act of making things work the way they should have worked all along. Reform rippled outward from the throne room, like circles expanding from stones dropped in still water, reaching every corner of the kingdom where citizens had learned to expect disappointment from their government, and would now discover the pleasant surprise of systems that actually functioned, officials who actually helped, bureaucracy that actually served, rather than extracting service from those it was supposed to serve. Sometimes the system remembers its purpose. The king reflected as evening deepened into night, as the palace settled into the quiet satisfaction of authority exercised wisely, of power used well, of governance that had rediscovered the difference between ruling and serving, between commanding and helping, between demanding loyalty and earning the respect that made loyalty voluntary rather than compelled. And now you drift back to your bed, carried by the gentle current of resolution that flows like a river returning to the sea, like breath returning to natural rhythm after the held tension of anticipation finally releases into the satisfaction of justice served and problems solved through the simple application of attention to what deserved attention, care to what needed care, power to what required power, exercised on behalf of those who had no power to exercise on their own behalf. The temporal transition carries you from that ancient throne room back to your own time, your own place, your own pillow that waits to receive the weight of thoughts that have been lightened by witnessing authority. Remember its purpose. Bureaucracy rediscover its function. Systems recall why they existed before they learned to exist primarily for themselves. You float backward through centuries like a dreamer returning from distant lands, carrying with you the memory of justice done and the hope that justice might be done again when circumstances require it. What this ancient story whispers to modern hearts becomes clear as you settle into the familiar comfort of your own space, your own time, your own challenges with systems that sometimes forget their purpose in the comfortable darkness of routine administration, procedural habits, bureaucratic momentum that moves forward, not because it knows where it's going, but because it has forgotten how to stop and remember why it started moving in the first place. The emotional reflection that accompanies your return to the present carries the warm satisfaction of resolution, achieved not through conflict, but through understanding, not through force, but through recognition, not through punishment, but through reform that served everyone better than punishment could have served. The ancient king's wisdom echoes across centuries, reminding modern hearts that power exists to serve rather than to be served, that authority earns legitimacy through attention to those it governs rather than through attention to its own preservation. Universal. Truths reveal themselves in the eternal human search for fairness that transcends particular times and specific places, connecting the citizen who stood before that ancient throne with every person who has ever faced systems that seemed designed to frustrate rather than facilitate, to extract rather than serve, to complicate rather than simplify the basic human transactions that make civilized life possible. Bureaucracy and humanity dance the same steps across centuries, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, always with the potential for either outcome, depending on whether those who lead remember why they lead. Perhaps you've stood before your own palace gates. You realize as sleep begins to soften the edges of waking thought, faced your own bureaucratic labyrinths, carried your own grievances to authorities who seemed more interested in procedure than in justice, more concerned with regulation than with resolution, more committed to maintaining systems than to making systems work for those they supposedly served. The ancient citizen's courage in speaking truth to power resonates with every modern moment, when truth needs speaking and power needs hearing what it might prefer not to hear. The comfort that comes from continuity settles around you like a familiar blanket, the understanding that the eternal human search for fairness continues in your time as it continued in that ancient time, that justice sleeps lightly in every era, always ready to awaken when called by voices willing to speak and ears willing to listen. When citizens remember their right to be heard and rulers remember their obligation to hear what citizens need to say about the systems they both share and must both live with. Personal connection bridges the gap between ancient grievance and modern understanding, between that throne room and your bedroom, between the citizen's courage and your own potential for similar courage when circumstances require it, when systems need reminding of their purpose, when authority needs gentle correction from those who live with the consequences of how authority exercises itself in daily transactions that shape the quality of ordinary life. The preparation for sleep that has been building throughout this long evening's journey toward resolution now completes itself as your mind releases the day's tensions into the capable hands of rest that waits to receive them, to process them, to transform them into the dreams that sought experience into wisdom, events into understanding, stories into the deeper truths that stories carry when they're told with care and received with attention. Justice sleeps lightly, dreaming of tomorrow's opportunities to serve those who need serving, to protect those who need protection, to reform what needs reforming when reform becomes necessary for the health of communities that depend on systems working properly rather than simply working for those who operate them. The ancient king's wisdom settles into your consciousness like seeds planted in fertile soil, ready to grow when conditions require the growth of understanding about how power and responsibility connect, how authority and service intertwine, how governance and care must dance together rather than separately. The final wisdom of this ancient tale whispers itself into your settling thoughts, that bureaucracy at its best serves human flourishing rather than institutional preservation, That systems at their finest facilitate, rather than frustrate, the common human project of living together with dignity and mutual support. That authority at its most legitimate exists to help rather than to hinder, to simplify rather than to complicate, to serve rather than to extract service from those who provide the foundation upon which all legitimate authority ultimately rests. Rest. Well, the evening story concludes as your breathing deepens into the natural rhythm of approaching sleep, as your muscles release the day's accumulated tensions into the darkness that welcomes them, as your mind begins the transition from waking thought to dreaming wisdom, from conscious consideration to unconscious processing, from active engagement to passive reception of whatever truth sleep might bring through dreams that sort and settle the day's experiences into tomorrow's understanding. Dream gently. The ancient voices suggest across the centuries that separate their time from yours. Let history hold your troubles while you rest, while you restore your strength for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, whatever systems might need your attention, whatever authorities might benefit from hearing what you have learned about the difference between power exercised well and power exercised poorly, between service given and service extracted, between justice done and justice delayed, until delay becomes denial. Let history hold your troubles. The final whisper suggests, as sleep approaches like a gentle tide that lifts and carries you toward the rest you have earned through the day's work, the evening's attention, the night's patient listening to stories that connect your time with all times, your struggles with all struggles, your hope for justice with the eternal human hope, that fairness will find its way into systems that sometimes forget why they exist, but can always remember when reminded by voices willing to speak and hearts willing to listen to what voices have to say about making the world more just, more kind, more worthy of the dreams that sleep will soon bring to restore and refresh your faith in possibility.